This fucking guy comes to me a few days ago and says, "Hey, I think the Hobbit movies are actually great." And now we're here talking about them.
I've always felt that way, to be clear. But what I was surprised with on my rewatch of the Hobbit movies was how my opinion of each individual movie drastically changed from what I thought they were 10 years ago. If you were to
Yes.
ask me a year ago what my favorite Hobbit movie was, I'd have told you Desolation of Smaug. Now, it's probably my least favorite Hobbit movie. And I just think that's insane. I don't know what I was thinking 10 years ago. I kind of do. Smaug is one of the best parts of the entire trilogy, and I really, really liked him. I still really, really like him. But I think I was a lot more forgiving of all the really stupid shit surrounding that movie because they did Smaug really well, for the most part.
Yeah, so here we're cashing in on this extremely relevant trilogy at the peak of its import. So I remember watching the first Hobbit movie being like, that was awesome. I remember you and I watched Smog together and thinking, that was awesome.
Did we?
And then yeah.
Oh, okay.
And we both walked out of the theater being like, that was awesome. That was great. And then I watched Battle of the Five Armies right when it came out. Thought it wasn't very good. Haven't honestly thought that much about the Hobbit movie since then. Until now, when I rewatched all three of them. And,
And you were very willing to do that. You didn't complain whatsoever in the last 3 days.
yeah, the Hobbit movies exist.
I wanted to bring up something that you said while you were doing this that I want to discuss with you first. And I think this will be a good precursor to us discussing the actual movies. You said that while you were watching these movies, you were pretty frequently looking up what was an adaptation and what was added in from the book. And you said something that surprised me, but also I don't 100% disagree with, but I also want to discuss with you, is that you're not sure that if you would like the Hobbit book if you read it today.
Well, yes. I would say I think personally I haven't read The Hobbit in a long, long time. And I feel honestly the same way about the Lord of the Rings books to a lesser extent, where just I felt like the Lord of the Rings movies have always been the way that I prefer to consume the universe. Some people might kill me for that. Honest to God, that's just how I feel. It's for one, I saw the movies first before I read the books, and I just like movies. I don't know. Um, and so for the purposes of The Hobbit, I was just thinking like I was curious what things were part of the movie that like were changed or like significantly altered or just added, out of nowhere because they needed to fill three movies versus what was an intentional choice just because that would give me a sort of a better idea of okay, what was something about this that I just maybe wouldn't have agreed with, a choice that I just wouldn't have agreed with at all, or something that was maybe it worked better in the medium of the book, but didn't work better or didn't work as well in the movie, or maybe like they changed something that made it not work as well in the movie. And so I was just curious about things like that. And pretty early on in the movie, there was an example of that I'll get into in a second. But so that's what I have to say about that. Like I said, the book is not like very precious to me. So destroying it by adding double, triple, whatever the length of material doesn't really affect me on like an emotional level. I was just more curious about like what the changes were.
Interesting use of word there. The book isn't precious to you. I would say
Yeah.
that the book is precious to me, but despite that, I was not overtly angry about a lot of the changes or the additions that they made, mainly because it has been a long time since I've read the book as well. But The Hobbit is kind of close to my heart because it's one of the first books I've ever read, and it's one of the first books I ever read multiple times because I read it when I was very young, and then I read it again for a school project based on J.R.R. Tolkien that we had to do, where we had to study an author and read one of his works in a class that we actually took together. That's where we met, was that fifth grade class where we had to do that project. I read The Hobbit again in that time. It might be the first book I read twice because of that. It's hard to tell because I can't remember a lot of back then in my life. I enjoyed the book both times. I was also a kid, so it was, The Hobbit is supposed to be a children's book. It's supposed to be geared towards that age range, so it makes sense that I enjoyed it. As an adult, I've heard criticisms of the book that I kind of agree with when I think about it. Like, it immediately introduces way too many characters, and it's really hard to follow coherently throughout the story when you have 14 main characters. That makes sense. I remember that being hard for me to do as a kid as well. But what I wanted to ask you is, you didn't really answer my question. Do you think it would be a good book? Like, do you think you would like it if you read it today?
I mean, I think I'd enjoy it because I like spending time in the universe and stuff, but I do feel like I would read it and it would feel like reading a children's book, where it would awaken, a certain kind of excitement in me, childlike wonder, but that I would look at it, and if I was trying to like think about it intellectually, I'd be like, this thing is definitely whatever it is, 80 years old or 90. How old is that thing?
He wrote it, if I'm not mistaken, in 1932.
Yeah, so the thing is nearly 100 years old. So I feel like it's just like, to me, honestly, it's just like an old movie at some point. Like, if I sat down and watched Citizen Kane right now, I'd be like, yeah, this movie was definitely made in 1940, and time has just changed. And I feel like if I read a 100-year-old children's book, I'd probably feel the same way to some extent.
Well, that's part of why I think, even if The Hobbit has its flaws, it deserves a lot of credit. It's similar to the argument that we had, or the debate that we had about Snow White, in regards to our animated movie tournament that we're also releasing probably alongside this video. It's not like the most exciting or the most like intellectual story, but it set the groundwork for a lot of kids movies and animated movies that came after it, because it is the first ever animated movie. Even for it being that, it holds up pretty well. I feel very similarly about The Hobbit. The Hobbit is the first ever introduction that we have to the fantasy world that Tolkien created, that inspired so many more fantasy worlds. Basically every fantasy world game, like D&D, Game of Thrones, so many of these middle-aged fantasy worlds were inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien. He created elves as we know them in fantasy. He created dwarves as we know them in fantasy. And The Hobbit was the very first introduction to that world. To me, it deserves huge credit for that. For it being the very first thing of its kind like that, it holds up very well. Even if it's not perfect when it comes to like what we expect from a modern day story.
Yeah, I feel like I've dug myself into a hole with the Hobbit book. So let's talk about the movies, because here's where I actually have real negative thoughts.
What I was about to say is that doesn't exactly translate to the movies, because the movies were made 10 years ago. But they were based off of a work of fiction that was 100 years ago. And that's something I think we should keep in mind while judging these movies.
I will argue that given the extent to which so much was changed and how much material was added to create these movies, besides like the most core elements, very little seems so sacred that you couldn't improve upon it. Which is why I don't want to constantly be drawing comparisons to the book, because anything they wanted to change, again, unless it was like Bilbo doesn't find the ring, they could have changed, because they changed so much. So things that I might not love in the book are still on the movie a bit, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm just saying, like, overall, that's a big reason why I also give these movies leeway, at least in the sense of the things that they adapted directly from the book. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's fair. But let's start talking about the movies by talking about something that they did not adapt from the book, and in my opinion, immediately tells you what kind of movies you're in for. The very beginning of An Unexpected Journey, where you just have the gratuitous Frodo cameo.
You mean the scene from The Lord of the Rings.
I just right out of the gate, I can already tell. Not only, so here's the real problem I have with that scene. It's not so much that Frodo shows up, even though that does feel like kind of a lame cash grab to show you the things that you like from the franchise that you remember actually being good. To me, the problem is, the thing that really bothers me is the fact that dialogue is meant to have happened immediately, like right before the start of Fellowship, because at the end of that scene, Frodo is going to go out there and wait for Gandalf. It's not like, while Bilbo is working and it's Frodo and it just like happens to be at some point. They're literally already putting so much of their weight onto the original Lord of the Rings trilogy in the first scene. I just think it sets a bad tone. And that what I just said there about it putting all of its weight on Lord of the Rings is what just dogs the whole franchise all the way through. And this leads me to say is my thesis. And I'm just going to give it right now. You said to me that not watching these and comparing them to Lord of the Rings made them more enjoyable. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. Because my argument is that the movies are trying to have their cake and eat it too. In the sense of, if you divorce yourself entirely from the Lord of the Rings movies, you just put them on the shelf and you just judge purely what you have in front of you, the movies are a convoluted mess full of stuff that doesn't make any sense and doesn't have anything to do with the story that's supposedly central to the trilogy. But if you do watch them with Lord of the Rings in mind, then the movies are a bunch of fan service that muddies things that made Lord of the Rings good and make sense. So the only way I feel like you can approach these movies with like a really strong optimism is if you only think about Lord of the Rings when it's convenient for the movie, and when you ignore Lord of the Rings when it's convenient for the movie. If you give the trilogy that concession at every single point, then yeah, I mean, it's an enjoyable experience. It's not gonna, like, destroy the franchise for you like the later Transformers sequels, but you really have to give the movie every single benefit of the doubt on, like, a scene-to-scene basis to get to that point. And I just feel like for like a super franchise that costs like hundreds of millions of dollars, I just feel like, frankly, I shouldn't have to do that. I shouldn't have to give the movie so much benefit of the doubt that I essentially like force myself to think it's good. Or I guess not movie, trilogy.
Well, so while I agree with what you're saying overall, the parts where it's like a callback to Lord of the Rings, or they're specifically referencing something that's Lord of the Rings related that wasn't in the book, those are definitely the weakest parts of the trilogy for me. However, the specific part that you mentioned in the very beginning, I have a little bit of a defense for that, because technically in the very beginning of the Lord of the Rings, that scene that they're referencing, the opening of the Lord of the Rings is Bilbo writing the beginning of The Hobbit. When he's talking about concerning hobbits and he's telling you about hobbits and how they live, that's the opening of The Hobbit, the actual book. And so they couldn't do that in The Hobbit, because they had already done it in Lord of the Rings. Again, you do have to think about Lord of the Rings when it's convenient. But if they had done that again, it would have been just a blatant copy-paste of what they had done for the opening of Lord of the Rings. So I think the closest thing they could have done, if they were going to go for a Lord of the Rings scene or do something Lord of the Rings related, to like showing Bilbo when he's older and like looking back, was referencing that scene right up until it was about to happen. Because that's literally what happened the next scene. After the opening of The Hobbit is the opening of The Lord of the Rings chronologically. And in that opening, he's reading the first page of The Hobbit. If they hadn't done that in Lord of the Rings, I think it would have actually been kind of a cool thing to do in The Hobbit, is open The Hobbit the exact same way that the Hobbit book had opened. But they'd already done that in Lord of the Rings. So I think they gave you kind of the next best thing. And I see why that you would think that that's basically what, like, a beginning of what they had done for the rest of the trilogy, which is callbacks to Lord of the Rings and fan service to Lord of the Rings. That makes sense because there is a lot of that in the trilogy. But I think for this initial example, it's a little bit more forgiving. They couldn't do probably what they would have done if they hadn't already done it in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I can see that. I have two ways to, like, we can go through the movie itself, or I can go through all my Lord of the Rings complaints, because I have plenty.
About the movies, or about, like, their callbacks to Lord of the Rings?
About the callback, like, about the Lord of the Rings connections. Or I can just go through, like, the first movie.
Well,
So we were discussing this, like, do we want to talk about the movies like we did Star Wars, or do we want to just talk about whatever?
I think we should go through the movies. I think that's a way that we can both give props and criticisms to the movies, like, in a balanced way. Because we could go into the things we don't like and then just shit on it for 30 minutes and then, like, you know, come around. But I think it'd be more balanced if we went through each movie and talked about what we liked and didn't like.
Fair enough. So right out of the gate, I want to talk about an example of what I was saying earlier about things from the book and me not knowing how much I'd like them in the book or if they work better in the book, which is, I think the movie runs into sort of a problem with Bilbo's character. Martin Freeman's performance is incredible, basically at all points in time. Even when there are concerns about the writing and the pacing, he's trying his best. At every single moment as he's on screen, he has great acting with just his mannerisms, his expressions, his voice, everything top to bottom A plus. But I do think there are times when the structure of the movie kind of makes Bilbo the character kind of fall short of what Martin Freeman's trying to do. And so right out of the gate, one of the things that stuck out to me is and this is what made me think, I'm curious if this was in the book, let me go find out. And it pretty much is, where so the idea is that Bilbo is supposed to have lost whimsy and become kind of a stick in the mud, right? Like that's what Gandalf is saying. He's like, you know, the when I knew you when you were younger, you had dreams of going to see the elves and stuff like that, and now you just sit here and read and garden, right?
Yeah.
My thing is, starting off the movie, we have two scenes with Bilbo to kind of get us to that point. The first one is when Gandalf approaches him, and Bilbo basically, I mean, he's kind of just expositing, but it's not like terrible. But he's just like, no, I don't want to go on an adventure. In fact, I don't think anybody in this town would want to go on your adventure. You got to go find someone else. Okay, so that's one. So we get a little bit of something from Bilbo out of there because he's like, he's telling you a little bit about himself and he's telling you a little bit about the world through this just random interaction that's supposed to kick the plot into gear. That's fine. But then the second thing that happened is the dwarves take over his house. And his like reaction to this is supposed to impress upon you the start of the character arc that Bilbo is going to be going through, which is like he lives this kind of boring, mediocre life and he should pursue adventure. The problem is, in my opinion, that setup for Bilbo's character is a little bit undercut by the fact that the thing that he is like reacting negatively to is something that he is 100% justified in being unhappy with. 13 strangers have come into his house, are eating all his food, and are showing blatant disregard for his property. And the movie's like trying to shame him into being like, oh, this guy's no fun. I'm trying to think of another example, but I've seen that stuff before where it's like, the character who's supposedly like the more adult or mature or whatever is treated as like the loser who needs to learn to cut loose. And if you look at it objectively, it's like, no, that person's totally in the right. They're being rational and responsible and their opinions are justified. It's like how when you grow up, you start to understand Squidward a little more. It's kind of like that. Like Bilbo is totally entitled to be upset about what's happening to his house, but it's supposed to jumpstart his character arc, and it just, I don't know, I feel like there's something missing there of like, he's totally in the right, but the movie makes it look like he's like the fun police. So that's one of the things that I was like, is that in the book? And yeah, it pretty much works the same way in the book.
Well, counter argument, there's one integral piece that doesn't work the same way in the book that I think is actually one of the rare moments that they changed from the book to the movie for the better, which is that in the book, Bilbo's basically forced to go on this adventure. He has no say, which I think would give a lot more credence to your argument here, saying like, no, he's totally in the right. Why are we supposed to expect him to want to go on this adventure when he doesn't want to? He literally is being forced to. But in the movie, he doesn't want to go on the adventure, and then at the very last second changes his mind. And I think that makes the whole scene a lot more acceptable. Because yeah, he is completely in the right, being upset about all these dwarves coming in and messing up everything and eating all his food. So I don't really get the impression that we as the audience are supposed to be upset with him for not going on the adventure. I feel like we're supposed to be just as flabbergasted about the way that they're going about this, because all the dwarves are being crazy and exhibiting traits that we've never seen and he's never seen as a hobbit even. And we get the exposition that he's a shut-in, that he doesn't like to go out and do anything, that he rarely has company. But the idea that he very firmly doesn't want to go on this adventure until the very last second where he decides that he does, I think is that kickstart that they still keep consistent throughout the first movie, especially because there are parts in the first movie where he very much feels like he doesn't belong on this adventure. Like even though he went, there are things that are reinforcing the fact that he should have stayed. And it's not till the very end of the first movie that he finally kind of accepts that he does belong on this adventure, because he has a home and the dwarves don't. And I think that's very touching, especially with how the dwarves treated his home. If you go into that scene thinking that these dwarves haven't really had a home for years and years and years, and now they're entering this really comfortable place where a wizard told them they can make themselves at home and do whatever they wanted, that makes sense to me, and that's kind of funny even. And it's really touching that Bilbo has this full circle moment from going from not wanting to go to going last second to doubting himself in that decision throughout the entirety of the adventure to kind of firmly standing in the ground, making a firm decision to help these people and to go on this adventure, not because of his wants and needs, but because of theirs. Like, I think that's a really cool arc for Bilbo to have gone through. And I think that's very much reinforced with the changes they made in the movie of Bilbo kind of making his own decision to go on this adventure and not being forced to.
So I totally agree with you, because I do know that in the book, Gandalf effectively makes him go, and in the movie, he makes his decision. And I do think that's a stronger point, because it does show that he took something away from what Gandalf was saying and his reflection as a character. And he definitely needs to have more agency to be the main character, even though he's not for the second two movies, but we'll get to that in a second. My point was just more like, so what do we know about the adventure? We know that a bunch of people have come into his house and basically blatantly ignored his requests to not pillage his food, and that if he goes on this adventure, he's probably going to die. So with those 2 points, I feel like, okay, we're in a position where it makes sense, right? Like, all of these elements that are laid out make sense. The point where I start to feel like, what am I as the audience supposed to be like feeling here, is that Gandalf is lecturing him like he's the one in the wrong in this situation. And it's like, all you've done is introduce me to a bunch of strangers who are acting like idiots and ask me to follow them to my death. Like, I feel like the payoff is much better than the setup in that regard, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think they both go hand in hand, but I do agree that Gandalf taking that position is a little... If we're going off of The Lord of the Rings, it's definitely not a position we'd expect Gandalf to take, because Gandalf is the voice of reason in The Lord of the Rings. He's the guiding force, the one who is all-knowing and, even all-understanding. I think that Gandalf... he's kind of he's a very different character in The Hobbit than he is in The Lord of the Rings, if you really think about it. At least his gray version. In The Lord of the Rings, he's more of that, like, Dumbledore character. He's not forcing anyone to do anything, but there is that sense of, like, Frodo has to undertake this journey for, like, the good of mankind. Like, it's not like he's... Hey, come do this fun thing with me. It's more like he's this guiding figure telling Frodo that if he doesn't go and do this thing, then a lot of people will die, and it's the fate of the world and all that. And so I think it's kind of jarring to see him come and this very much like lesser stakes adventure. I mean, it's still kind of a guiding figure, I feel like, from his perspective, because he's talking about Bilbo, how he used to be as a child and how he's grown up, and how he feels like child Bilbo would be much more excited to do this. I think it's just the difference between the characters that we see The Hobbit and in Lord of the Rings for Gandalf. Like, if it wasn't Gandalf who had come in and recruited Bilbo, do you think you would still feel like it wasn't as good of a setup?
No, yeah, I think, like I said, my thing would just be more like, I feel like there's just a poor communication to the audience of, like, if you're establishing a character, you should be able to line up what you're being sort of told about the character with the plot. And I feel like they do not work in tandem, because the plot is telling you Bilbo is acting totally rationally and being a reasonable person, but the dialogue of the movie is telling you Bilbo is a no fun weenie. And But anyway, this, like, we've got so much more to get through. So I do want to point out one minor thing. I do feel like dwarves that barely understand the concept of silverware, I'm kind of surprised they have written legal contracts for their adventures. Not really a flaw, just something I thought was kind of funny. Also, while we're on the subject, though, I want to talk about another Lord of the Rings connection, because I'm curious if... I'm assuming this wasn't in the book, but feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. It bugs me that they repeatedly, throughout the trilogy, talk about Moria and, like, acknowledge what's happened there. Because, again, this takes place decades before the movies, and Gimli and the Fellowship doesn't know about this, despite the fact that apparently the dwarves have known about it for decades. So, is the idea that it was, like, the center of this battle and then, like, retaken and then lost again more recently in the time of Fellowship? Like, just why? Why is it here? Why are we talking about it? That was just a minor thing that bugged me with the timeline. It's like, so Moria's been out of Dwarven control for like 70, 60, 70 years, and Gimli still doesn't know it.
Well, according to Google, because I couldn't remember either, Moria is referenced in the book. What you were saying is that you find it surprising that Gimli had no idea about the ongoings in Moria in the Lord of the Rings movies?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, information in Middle Earth is not spread as easily as it is in modern day. So I kind of can suspend my disbelief a little bit, thinking that a whole group of dwarves mining into a huge like mountain, and a lot of the dwarves on the outside not really knowing about the ongoings. I think the passage of time is a little weird. Like the fact that Balin and everybody in the mines of Moria were decayed skeletons. It kind of suggests that it's been a very, very long time that these people have been dead. But I think the idea that Gimli has no idea about them not being dead in the first place isn't too much of a suspension of disbelief for me, just because I don't think that information like that travels very fast or far in Lord of the Rings.
See, I'm totally willing to get there to that point, other than the fact that I'm not sure, but either his father definitely knew about it or was there when it happened. I don't know if it was implied that like any of the other dwarves besides Thorin and his father and grandfather were at that battle, but Gloin definitely knows about it.
Oh, you mean at the battle in the Hobbit? You mean?
Yes.
And you think that Gimli should know about that battle of Moria?
Yes, because his father either was close friends with people who were there, or might have even been there himself. I don't know. This is a dumb thing to get hung up on, but I just like, I don't know. It just, the timeline's fucking weird.
Well, I think that's because that definitely wasn't in the book. I believe that the Battle of Moria with the pale orc and all that shit, I don't think that was in the book.
And I mean, also, to be fair, Lord of the Rings, like, the fact that in Fellowship, Gandalf just fucking tries to deflect rather than just telling Gimli, man, we shouldn't go there. It's been taken over by goblins, nearly gets them all killed. So I'm not going to pretend like this is a Hobbit exclusive problem, because that Moria just seems to generate dumbass plot points.
Well, that's a thing that they also changed from the books to the movies in Lord of the Rings. In Lord of the Rings, Gandalf had no idea that Moria had been overrun by goblins, nor that that the Balrog was there. In the movie, it's definitely implied. I don't know if it's implied that he knew about the goblins, but it's definitely implied that he knows about the Balrog.
Oh, 100%, because he says he doesn't want to go.
Right. In the books, he has no idea, has no clue. So that was an odd change.
Interesting. It's been a while since I've read Fellowship, so I didn't think about that. Now, I will say, to stop being negative, because I've got plenty more time for that, the dwarves in the first movie are pretty cool. There's a real sense of honor and a real sense of camaraderie to them, especially in the first movie. And the movie doesn't really, I think, spend a lot of time on this. In fact, unfortunately, I think later it kind of contradicts this. But they talk about how, like, they're not legendary heroes. It's kind of a ragtag group. And so that makes the stakes higher. And it makes you respect them when they do stuff like stand up to the trolls. Like, this isn't the chosen class. I mean, even, like, the Fellowship, even though half of them are hobbits, but put that aside for a second. Like, this isn't like kind of an elite gathered group. This is just a bunch of dudes who kind of are friends or have become friends, you know. And other than from a Bilbo perspective, I'm not a huge fan of the dinner scene, but from a dwarf perspective, it's awesome because you get to learn a lot about the dwarves. You get to see them do a lot of cool stuff. It's one of the few moments when all of their personalities shine, or many of their personalities get to shine. So other than that, that scene is good.
I think it's about the best introduction you could make for one that's introducing 13 other characters. Which, again, I think that the decision to do that falls squarely on the book. It's maybe the biggest criticism I've ever heard of the book, is that introducing that many characters right away and having to follow them throughout the story, it's hard to do. Even in the movie, it's hard to do. But the movie does a really good job at making every dwarf's design unique and their personalities unique. I think that you're right. There is a sense of loyalty and camaraderie. I think Thorin, even though he's the most, like, not dwarf looking of the dwarves, he has this very, like, regal, like, important look to him that, like kind of making him look like Aragorn in a way, almost favors the movies because it makes him stand out as the leader. He stands out as the one that's probably the most important of the dwarves. Not like literally the most. I mean, kind of literally. He's supposed to be the king under the mountain, and he's the one putting the expedition together. But it just gives him a sense of like he stands out among all these like really gruff, bearded, stout men. You know, sometimes if they didn't have so many shots of him standing next to men or elves, I forget that he's even short. You know, that's how much he stands out among these dwarves,
No, I agree with you.
which are all very clearly short, stout people. I'm gonna just kind of go off on how much I like this first movie for a little bit. I think the first movie has some of the best sense of adventure in the entirety of the Middle Earth movies, even in Lord of the Rings, because I don't think Lord of the Rings is supposed to give off a feeling that you're about to embark on an adventure. I think it's more of like a high stakes. I was about to say high stakes journey. I feel like another word for that could be adventure, but I don't get the sense of adventure in Lord of the Rings like I did in this first movie.
No, I agree with you. Like between Fellowship and Unexpected Journey, like both of them have clear quest goals, but I think there's a little bit more of a sense that like the road in Unexpected Journey is unclear. They just kind of know where they're going, but they're not sure how they're going to get there and what they're going to encounter. Whereas in Fellowship, the next thing they leave is sit down and try to plan exactly what they're going to do.
Right, right. I think Unexpected Journey has a much more D&D feel to it in that way, where there's a vague goal, but you got a ways to go. That you don't know what's going to happen in between. You know, the things are going to happen. Characters are going to have moments. I honestly think that the Hobbit story would be a great D&D adventure. That's just something I've thought about while watching these movies.
Oh, don't worry. I've got a D&D analogy queued up for something later.
Okay, cool. But the first movie specifically, I think, follows that through line of how an adventure is supposed to start really well. It has that structure, that beat by beat, like what I was talking about when we were talking about the prequels, where Phantom Menace doesn't really have like a through line for a story structure. It just kind of goes all over the place. Unexpected Journey not only has that through line, but I think it does it really well. It has that call to adventure where the character first resists but then accepts on his own terms. There's rising action. There's a B story, even though I think a lot of the B stories in the Hobbit movies are unnecessary because I don't think there really was a B story in the book. I think it was very focused on their adventure. So most B stories that are added in the Hobbit movies are basically complete additions that the films made. But I think that's the least egregious in the first movie. Like, one thing that we both agree on is that the first movie is probably the best of the three because it was the most accurate and the least filler, right?
Yes.
And I think that's a huge strength of the movie because the movie feels consistent all the way through with the story it's trying to tell, the settings, the progression. It doesn't feel like it very often deviates away from its core values and themes. In that way, it feels like a pretty good addition to the Lord of the Rings movies in the sense that it feels, I think, the most, not literally like a Lord of the Rings film, but like the quality of a Lord of the Rings film. Like, I think that the first Hobbit movie comes the closest of any... I mean, this is pretty obvious because we both have a lot of issues with the second and third movie, but I like the first movie so much that I would almost put it up there with the Lord of the Rings films. Not quite the same amount of quality, but I think it comes very close. There's so many things that I like about this movie. Bilbo's performance, you were already saying earlier, but in my opinion, Martin Freeman's performance as Bilbo is like an all-time performance. Even if the movies aren't perfect, his performance damn near is, and it stands up among like Aragorn, Frodo, Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings. And another thing, I think Gandalf in the Hobbit movies, even though it's a little jarring how different he is at first, I think he really does kind of come into the character that we know, which is a lot. It says a lot because there are a lot of characters in this trilogy that come back from Lord of the Rings that I think are completely unrecognizable. We'll get to that in the next movie. But I think there are some scenes that they adapted from the books that they did incredibly well. I think Riddles in the Dark is like right up there with some of the best scenes in the entirety of the Middle Earth saga. I think Riddles in the Dark is just as good as a good Lord of the Rings scene. They nailed that. It's like they took the scene out of my head when I read it in the book and put it on the film. It was exactly how I pictured it, and I loved it when I first saw it. Also, Gollum is great. He's exactly like how we remember him. If there's
Also, real quick, the theme song fucking rules.
Oh, yeah.
The dwarf one.
The Misty Mountains one?
That is as good a composition as the best ones in Lord of the Rings.
Yes, and
there's some problems with music, like them reusing stuff, but that original score is great, and it really does get that same fire going as some of the great ones from the original trilogy.
Absolutely, and I love the scene where they're all singing that song in Bilbo's house. To me, that was a very subtle way to get us to see that Bilbo was changing his mind. You know what I mean? Like, because we don't really have a point we can pin, an exact point where we see that Bilbo would change his mind. It almost happens kind of abruptly, but there are some subtleties where we see that, you know, Bilbo seems pretty firm in his decision, but there might be some doubts. And I think that scene is a great, like, super well executed way to show us that maybe Bilbo is going to accept this adventure. I mean, obviously we know as an audience that he will, because that's what the movie is. But the subtle way that they kind of plant that in our brains while we're still in the frame of thinking that he's not going to, because of what we've seen him do in the scene. You referenced the reuse of some music, and I know exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about the scene where Thorin is about to fight Azog again at the end of the movie, and they use the Ringwraiths theme.
Yeah, not my favorite moment.
So that's a moment that I believe that if you were to take Lord of the Rings out of your head, that moment is not nearly as bad as it would be if you were not thinking about Lord of the Rings in that moment. I understand that might be a lot to ask, because it's literally a song they used in the Lord of the Rings, so hearing that, you're going to be thinking about Lord of the Rings. But as like an epic background song to what's happening in that moment, it works really well. If you don't have the association with that song of it being like the Ringwraiths theme, it really feels like it fits the setting of Thorin is about to have a rematch with this orc while all of his friends are burning in a tree behind him, and it really does fit the stakes that are happening in that moment. So that's one of the examples that I have of, if you're just not thinking about Lord of the Rings in that moment, that scene actually works pretty well.
Quick counterpoint to that: if you translate the lyrics, it makes no sense, because the lyrics are specifically for the purpose of the Ringwraith. So even if you don't know anything,
well, luckily you're not Elvish. you're not sitting there with an Elvish translator.
But I'm just saying, like, this is kind of an example of what I'm talking about, and I don't mean to like pick on you about this, but like just as an analogy. If in Attack of the Clones, when Yoda and Count Dooku were having their duel, they started playing the Empire theme, like, wouldn't you just have to find that odd, just like on a fundamental level? And yeah, if you pretend like you don't know what the theme is, then it probably works fine in that scene. But like, could you do that?
Well, to be honest, my first thought is that's a kind of stupid theme to choose if you're going to reuse one. I don't see the Imperial March.
I'm just making a point.
No, I know. I get what your point is, and yes, I agree. But I also think that my point does stand, that if in Star Wars, in that scene where Yoda and Dooku fight, if they were to reuse a battle song, like if they were to reuse Duel of the Fates, which was a song they used in their previous movie, I think that would fit, even if in our minds we're calling back to his fight with Darth Maul. I think just on its own merit, the song fits the battle, even if it's a reuse. And in that same way, I think the song fits that scene of Thorin standing up to the Pale Orc, if we're not to think about where that song has been used previously.
I don't want to get stuck on this, but like my counterpoint to that is Duel of the Fates was used once. So that is not like one use does not a theme song make. It's with repeated uses throughout multiple films of a song in a context that you understand that it has that connotation.
Quick counter argument to that. Duels of the Fates was actually used twice. It was also used in Obi-Wan and Anakin's battle. And I'm actually undoing my own point here, because I do often think about that when I hear that in Anakin and Obi-Wan's battle. When Duel of the Fates comes on in that fight, I'm like, oh, hey, it's Duel of the Fates. It's the scene where Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon are fighting Maul. So I am a little bit undoing my own point there when I point that out.
I don't mind that much because there's a thematic link there.
Right.
There is no thematic link between Thorin and Azog and the Witch King.
Yes. I get that
okay, I'll let you have the last word on this one because we got so much other shit to get to.
No. I get that that's a hard ask. I'm not saying that's something that you should have to do. I'm not saying that's a plus that the movie is doing there. I'm just saying that I don't think it's as big as a negative as many people have pointed it out. I think casual Lord of the Rings fans, people that just really liked the original Lord of the Rings and then go watch The Hobbit, I don't think they're going to sit there and go, "Hey, that's the theme of the Ring Wraiths. That's kind of dumb." I think they're going to be like, "Oh, hey, I remember that song in the original trilogy. That's kind of a cool callback." And in an ideal world, you should be making the hardcore fans happy and also the casual fans happy. So I'm not saying that this is a plus. I'm just saying I don't think it's as big a negative as people point it out to be.
All right, fair enough. So I've got a couple. So do I go the dickheaded nitpick route or do I go the actual serious criticism route?
Well, are you going to be going both eventually?
Yes.
Start with the dickheaded nitpick.
Okay, so two things that I thought of that I noticed that just made me laugh. So one, the scene where they are trying to escape the orcs and Radagast says he will be the distraction.
Yeah.
He runs the worst distraction op I think I've ever seen in any movie ever. Why the fuck is he constantly turning to cross trajectories with the guys who are retreating? Literally, they will run a direction, he will hook around so that they're about to meet again, and Gandalf has to be like, no, okay, go that way. And then it happens like 3 more times.
I noticed that too.
If you are going to be the distraction, Gandalf says, okay, Radagast, we need to go west. I need you to be the distraction. You say, okay, you get on that sled with those rabbits, and you book it the fuck east, and you never look back. That was just weird, and just seemed kind of shittily written to make sure that the scenes stayed intense. What the fuck was he doing?
I gotta be honest, I noticed that too, and that's fucking hilarious because I thought the exact same thing. I was like, God, Radagast sucks at this. He's not distracting shit.
That was just one of the more... See, that is good. There's a difference between good, bad writing, like funny, good, bad writing, and like bad, funny, bad writing. And that is an example of good, funny, bad writing. Because it doesn't like ruin the movie. It doesn't make you like stop taking anything seriously. But it is funny to notice if you think about it in the like a more rational, nitpicky context. The second thing is about the Storm Giants, okay? Because, look, I don't know what the lore of those things are. As far as I know, they're like one sentence in the book, and they like never come up again. If those things existed, there is no way that Sauron is not using black magic to enslave them. 1 or 2 of those things would have won the entire battle of Pelennor Fields in Return of the King. So, I'm sorry, on a fundamental level, I reject that those things are out there, because there is no way that those things would not be enslaved and used for war. And if you want to tell me that, oh, they're like just that powerful, too bad, there's a dragon that basically seems like he could take over the entire world, except he has this one weakness. I don't know. Also, that scene sucks, because the fact that they don't get killed is 100% pointless, and just sucks out tension from the movie, because they get slammed in between 2 giant rocks, and without demonstrating any skill or cunning, they all just get ass backwards lucky and survive. Not my favorite scene. It is kind of cool, but not my favorite scene.
In a way, I agree with you. Not having a supposedly perilous situation where the dwarves just kind of make it out somehow and it's not really sufficiently explained, that does kind of take away from the stakes. But at the same time, when you're looking at the overall journey of their adventure, the more times they're put in perilous situations out of nowhere and then survive it, I think adds to the value of the adventure when it ends. It adds to like another thing that they've gone through altogether. It brings them closer. I don't think that scene is a good example of that happening. I agree that scene, I could take it or leave it. It doesn't ruin anything for me. It doesn't really add anything for me either. There's a lot of examples of this in this trilogy where, as Lindsay Ellis put it, the dwarves seem like they're made out of rubber. There's certain scenes where we're expected to think that they're in real danger, and then there's other scenes where it just feels like they should be in real danger, and somehow they're completely coming out unscathed, like the barrel scene, which we'll come up on soon. While I agree with that, I also think it's better to have more scenes of peril that have low stakes than to have nothing. Because the more scenes of peril that we're supposed to have, the grander the adventure feels, even if those scenes of peril aren't exactly the highest of stakes at that time.
See, I agree with that, but I do think one of the things that I just kind of find frustrating about the movie is, and this is an example of, I think, where Fellowship, I think, compares, like, more favorably to it, is if you're following, like, sort of maybe, let's say you're following just like a small group of characters on some kind of adventure, right? I feel like your options to put the characters in peril in ways that actually move the story forward are maybe a little more limited, because there's only so many situations that you'll be in before you just kind of burn through ideas that you have to progress a character. There are 15 people in this party, meaning that any moment of peril should advance the plot or our understanding of the characters in some way. And in Fellowship, they do this because every moment either advances the story into its next stage that's necessary to continue the momentum of the plot, or you learn something about a character, or a character does something consequential. Like the peril that comes from the storm on the mountain is Frodo having to make a judgment call when everyone's looking to him, and he makes a decision that then ends up with Gandalf getting killed, right?
Right.
That is something that progresses the plot. The mountain scene is an example of what's frustrating in these Hobbit movies, because they go into a scene in peril, they survive the peril, and you learn nothing about any of the characters, and nothing about that perilous situation naturally flows into the next perilous situation. And to be fair, there are plenty of perilous situations that have this, like the climax of the first movie, or the scene with the spiders, or whatever. Like, there are plenty of times where they can do that, but given that they have so many characters and so many things they could do, I do find it a little frustrating that it's like, how is there still, like, plot cul-de-sacs when you have so many characters? You could literally just pick a random dwarf and develop them somehow by giving them something to do in the Storm Giant scene or other scenes like that.
I agree with that. I think we should kind of give our closing thoughts on Unexpected Journey and move on.
Okay, well then real quick, I have one more, like, serious thing I have to say.
Okay.
Which is the goddamn White Council.
Okay, yeah.
I just, again, it's just emblematic of kind of what I feel like the problem is. It's a relatively long scene about a bunch of people arguing about a subplot that has a pretty tenuous connection to the main story at this point. Because my question, that in 3 movies I feel like they never did a very good job explaining, is why is Sauron here? Why is he making his presence obvious at this point in time? Why does he care about any of this shit? Why does anyone else care about any of this shit? And it just feels like where Lord of the Rings was epic, this movie is trying to be epic by, like, yanking up the stakes and trying to have a deeper connection to the broader universe. But it doesn't really end up working because, again, Sauron has basically no reason to be a presence right now. He doesn't have the ring. He has no power. His armies, to the extent that they're like his, seem very minimal. You know, it doesn't even seem like he has control over Mordor again entirely yet. So why is he doing this? Why is he here? And it's just emblematic of sort of a problem that I feel like comes from tying it in is Gandalf, especially. If Gandalf knows this stuff or believes this stuff, why does he care about the dwarven gold? Like, why in the second movie is he telling Thorin to go after it? because nothing that we know as fans of Lord of the Rings, and nothing that's established, again, nothing that we know if you take Lord of the Rings into account, and nothing that is established in the movies if you ignore them, makes sense for why this side quest character would be in this movie at all. And it's cool to see Elrond and Sauron pre-evil and stuff, but I just feel like it's shoehorned in, and it just reminds me of better movies.
It definitely is, and I agree with what you're saying. But real quick, I want to point out that Gandalf doesn't, when he discovers Sauron is here and has returned, he doesn't go back to the dwarves because he wants to, because he thinks it's more important. If you'll remember that once they have officially discovered that it is Sauron who has returned, he tells Radagast he has to go back because he has to finish that adventure that he started with the dwarves and Bilbo, so he can then come back and return to giving Sauron his full focus. He didn't feel like it was right to just leave them on their own after he had started that adventure with them. And it wasn't because he felt like it was more important, it was because he had to finish what he had started so that he could come back and deal with the more important thing. That's not me justifying their addition of this plot element. I actually think the addition of Sauron is probably my least favorite thing about the Hobbit movies. Not because they decided that the necromancer that was like barely referenced in one paragraph as a reason for Gandalf to leave the party was Sauron. I think that decision could have worked. I think the way that they executed it was shit. And
because it's way over the top.
Yeah, way over the top. If it was like I would almost prefer if it was like Gandalf going in kind of quelling an evil that he thought was getting a little too powerful and not finding out it was Sauron, but us as the audience finding clues that it was Sauron. That would be a really cool Easter egg, in my opinion, because I think it was integral, especially before the Lord of the Rings movies, that Sauron was not revealing himself at any point in time. It is really, really dumb that apparently in the Hobbit movies he had been very much revealing himself to a lot of powerful and prominent people in the Middle-earth universe, because it kind of takes away from that revelation in the Lord of the Rings movies that he's back, that that they have the One Ring and that Sauron has returned.
Yeah, again, if this all happened decades ago, that means that all of these clowns went like 60 years without investigating this.
Right.
And at any point, did Elrond or Gandalf? Well, I guess Gandalf was gone by the time this line was said in the third movie. But at any point, do any of them say, "Hey, Saruman, you remember the other day when you said leave Sauron to me? How's that going? You made any progress on that one?"
Yeah.
No one said that for 60 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's wrap up the first movie because I've got plenty more Sauron nitpicks for when he's even more prominent.
Well, what I like about the first movie so much is that there's the least amount of Sauron. Real quick, before I give my closing statements, I want to say one thing. One thing I really dislike about all these movies is Radagast. I don't like his character whatsoever. He adds nothing. He's kind of just a big dumbass who really doesn't add anything to the central plot. He exists entirely to embolden the Sauron B plot that I don't like. So Radagast as a character, I think, is like one of the worst additions that they've made to this trilogy. I'm sure you can agree with that, right?
Yes, I surprisingly hate him a little less than like other things. Mostly because I think his idea is kind of funny. Like a wizard of his caliber who doesn't want to work, I think is kind of an amusing concept. He's just in the movies too much and plays too much of a role in terms of screen time while not playing enough of a role in terms of progressing the story. So he's like, it's funny, I remembered him being more annoying than I thought he was this time, and just remembered him more as kind of a pointless distraction, which was better. Like, in a sense, that's better because I wasn't like groaning every time he's on screen because I didn't want to hear him talk. I was just more, he happened to only be in parts of the movie that I didn't think were good.
I just think his character as a concept is a little bit cliche. I think it's a funny idea. In writing, it's a funny idea, but in practice, the idea that there's a council of wizards, and the High Wizard is this big, grand, like, eloquent, powerful guy, meaning Saruman, who dislikes Radagast because he's this ragtag, dirty, rolls around in the mud with animals kind of wizard that he doesn't think much of, when in reality Radagast is right about all the things that he's saying, and that he's not being heard because of the way that he looks and the way that he acts. That's such a cliche to me that it really took away from the quality of the movie, especially this one, because this is when they established that with like the Wizard Order, that he's kind of looked down upon by all the wizards except for Gandalf. But he's right about everything, because that's just such an overplayed trope that I've seen in so many movies. Is the unlikely character happens to be right, and if only you had listened to him, just because he has bird shit in his hair for the whole fucking trilogy doesn't mean he's wrong. It's like, I just really didn't like that. I thought that was super cliche. I really liked the first movie. I think that overall, the quality of the first movie comes pretty close to being as good as one of the Lord of the Rings films. It has a sense of adventure and fun that even the Lord of the Rings films don't have, that I think is such a great lens to view this world through. I would watch the first Hobbit movie over and over and over again. If it didn't make me want to watch the next two, I would watch it so much all the time. And I think it's a great addition to the Middle-earth saga.
I don't like it quite that much, but it's definitely the best Hobbit movie, handily. It has the most complete story. It has the least amount of filler. It has two great moments at the beginning and end, or kind of the end. Because the climax of this movie is like, it's fine, but I don't think it's great. But Riddles in the Dark is great, and then there's a lot of good stuff going on in the beginning, and then there are some other parts that are good. So it's not Lord of the Rings tier for me, definitely, but it's definitely a class above its sequels for sure. All right, so The Hobbit: The Desolation of Smaug is
it's ass. It's shit. And why was this my favorite? I really want to go and have a conversation with my 16-year-old self and really ask him like, what?
Well, so here's my D&D analogy, right?
Okay.
This movie specifically, more than the other two, feels like a D&D game where everyone got drunk and the DM stopped saying no to anything. Because I do think this movie has a couple of advantages over the third one, in the sense of there is still an adventurous spirit going on for a lot of the movie. Now, it keeps pulling you away to stuff that doesn't matter, or subplots that get annoying, like, oh my god, the Master of Lake Town and his shitty worm tongue are an affront to God.
Talk about cliche, yeah.
Just hate everything about them. And then all the Sauron, Dol Guldur, Necromancer stuff. But I do think that there is a sense of adventure that this one still has. But it's just buried under so much crap that it's hard to appreciate. But I think if you're, again, maybe it takes being drunk or something, but if you're of a certain age or a certain disposition, you might get into the willy-nilly adventurousness of it all or something. I don't know. That's the best defense I got. Azog sucks. He's boring as hell. I wish they'd stop giving him so many of his own scenes.
Bolg is even worse. And he's the main orc in this movie.
There's a reason that it worked for Sauron, but after basically Sauron, there were no other focal point villains in Lord of the Rings. It's because they all either were like the Eye of Sauron, which is like not a character that you can communicate with, to the audience, or they were just nobodies and no one cared about them. So they knew to keep them mostly off screen. I mean, the Witch was cool, but he didn't have tons of dialogue scenes because they knew that would be pointless. So the fact that this movie starts out with this character that no one gives a shit about getting more orders, it's like, okay.
And there wasn't even really a good reason for the movie to switch up the villains like that. Like, it could have just been Azog, and there wouldn't have been much of a difference.
Yeah, also, introducing a villain, not having him die in the first movie, but then basically having him send out a peon to go do this movie for him, it definitely just feels like they didn't have enough to do with Azog, but they knew they wanted him for the third movie. So just some random thoughts I have. I don't know what this scene was like in the book. I'm assuming it's in the book to some extent. The fact that Gandalf was really afraid of Beorn seemed kind of weird to me. Yeah, he's a big, strong bear, but if something goes wrong, just magic him. How hard can it be? But that was just a minor thing that I thought of. But let's get to why this movie really kind of sucks, or one of the two reasons. And that is the fucking barrels.
Yes.
Oh my god. This scene is just not great. And you know what's the thing is, in a different movie with a different tone, maybe an animated movie, it would be hilarious. But it's not. And that's, again, sort of the problem is this movie wants to be childlike while also wanting to be Lord of the Rings, which was not all that childlike. You're trying to make soup and a sandwich out of the exact same ingredients, and it's impossible. You can't do both of these things at the same time.
Yeah, that scene is quite garbage. It honestly is the start of a big like hour chunk of the movie that I just found really unenjoyable. It's really annoying that the dwarves are basically made of rubber in that scene. But then when Keeley gets shot in the leg with an arrow that's apparently like a Mordor arrow and it's gonna like poison him to death, every time I watch this movie I have no idea that that's gonna be like a fatal thing for Keeley until they like explain it in that really lame like exposition scene where the orc is telling for no reason is telling Tariel and the elves that, oh, we got that one dwarf though. That was cool because it had nothing to do with what they were asking of the orc. They were asking the orc like where they were coming from and like what their goal was, and the orc just kind of starts going off about how like they actually got one of the dwarves. I don't even think he was the orc to shoot him because I think that orc got killed pretty quickly right after that happened. And yet that orc like somehow saw that and has been like obsessing over the fact that they actually like got one of the dwarves and is going to kill them.
And for some reason knows that information matters to one of the characters that he's speaking to for no fucking reason.
Right, yeah. It's just super forced. Like, there's no reason for any of that to be happening except for to move the plot in a way that you want it to be specifically moved.
Which is a great transition to one of the other things about this movie that sucks hard. This love triangle. It is horrendous.
Oh, it's awful.
It was worse than I remembered it.
Yeah, it's real
because,
bad.
One, there's absolutely nothing about it. Let's look at it from, like, the angles, right? There's the Legolas-Tariel angle, right? Legolas and Tariel's relationship and Legolas's, like, interest in her has nothing to do with Tariel. That concept is introduced in the movie only to progress the relationship between Legolas and his father. So in that story, in Legolas's story, she is literally like a cardboard cutout. Like, she doesn't matter at all. Mm. That is entirely meant to further the relationship of a different character. And then the Keeley Tariel side is stupid because she saves his life basically just because the spiders are worse than dwarves, and everyone's kind of on board with that. He makes a lewd joke, and all of a sudden she thinks that he's kind of attractive, just out of fucking nowhere.
Because he's, like, taller than most other dwarves? That was such a stupid line.
Yeah, which at the very least, you gotta flip that the other way. You gotta have him save her from the spider. Just give me something here. And then, I think they have, like, one conversation, and then they're, like, separated for a good chunk of the rest of the movie. It's just fucking horrible. Yeah. And it's all for a character. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the third movie, because the romance is, like, worse in the third movie, in my opinion. It's all for a character who doesn't matter. I'm sorry for Tariel, but she doesn't matter. Because she was made up out of whole cloth for the movie, and therefore does not organically fit in the universe, and therefore her story doesn't matter to the ultimate saga of Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Right? Like, she leaves sad with, like, no closure, other than, I guess, Thranduil doesn't hate her anymore, or hates her less. And that's it. She's lost to the void forever because she's not in the other movies. So if you make up a character like this, they either have to die themselves, or you have to be willing to cap them off in a way like you did with the other dwarves. It's just terrible. Yeah. It's just bad.
It's incredibly forced, and it's like they couldn't even kind of like give them any moments to breathe, to like maybe give us like, you're right, like it would have been easy for them to just have him save her too, and that would at least give us a tiny bit of foundation for why they might like each other. Even then it wouldn't be great, but it would like be something. We have nothing here. Like, she saves him over and over again and likes him for what? Because, like, he said his mom wants him to get home safely. Like, there's that one scene where they talk while he's in prison, and he makes like a few jokes to her, and she talks about walking in the starlight and like liking the moon and whatever, and he's like, oh, my mom wants me to get back home safe. And then suddenly they're in love. Like, suddenly they super care about each other, and he's the one dwarf that's like going to be fatally injured in that ridiculous rubber barrel scene, which we haven't shit on enough, by the way. I want to go back to that after this. I just think that like it's so incredibly forced. Also, Legolas is nothing like his character in Lord of the Rings. He is unrecognizable in this movie, and it pisses me off because a lot of people I've heard say, well, Legolas is younger in this movie. He hasn't learned, how to be. He doesn't have as much wisdom as he does in Lord of the Rings. Legolas is like 4,000 years old, right? Like he's very, very old. He's an elf, so maybe he's still in his younger years, but it's not like 100 years is a big deal to a fucking elf. You don't have a complete change of character and personality in 80, 60 years that it takes place in between Hobbit and Lord of the Rings.
Well, it's also the same thing with Tauriel. Like, Tauriel is probably centuries, if not millennia old, and Legolas constantly has to explain to her lore about the world.
Yeah.
And it's like, aren't you... And one other thing I want to say about Tauriel, because then I want to move on from this, is, to me, it's a good example. And as a guy, look, I'm not qualified to dig too deep into this, but I'm just going to give, like, a general overview of how it... It's a great example of like the shitty faux feminism of Hollywood, because you were given the idea that, oh, Tauriel's a badass woman because she fights in that cool way like Legolas does, and she's a woman, and that's like empowering to see a woman fight like that and stuff. And I mean, in a sense that works, but you have to reinforce it with the character. And they immediately crap the bed on that by having her immediately be attracted to someone who she has like deep-rooted racial tensions with because he makes a dick joke. Yeah. Like, that is so lame, and that so betrays the idea that, because that's like the message, that's like the non-feminist message, is like, oh guys, if you just make her laugh once, she's yours forever. Right. And it's like, that's literally the opposite of what you were trying to get us to do, but because you haven't thought about it and you don't understand it, you're not executing any kind of female empowerment thing.
Right. She was definitely just an addition to the books because there are no women in the Hobbit books, really. I think there aren't any.
Nope.
So she was definitely just like a addition that they probably felt like they had to make and didn't put any effort into. Which is sad because there probably was potential for a good character to come of this. And what I was saying about Legolas before, like, that argument that he's young and naive 60 years out of his 4,000 before this point, is moot because I think he actually is a lot closer to the character we know in the next movie for no reason, really. Like, there's been no huge... maybe because he witnessed a dragon, ransacking a village. Like, maybe... But it's like his character...
Witnessed is also giving a lot of credit. He like saw the beginning for 5 seconds before he rode back off.
Right.
He wasn't there.
Right, and he, like, to me, that speaks to it making no sense that he acts the way he does in this movie. Because in the third movie, he's actually a lot closer to the character that we know. He's also a lot more, like, understanding and, like, kind of a good guy to Tauriel. Like, in the third movie, I think it would make a lot more sense if Tauriel, again, this would be forced and not good, but I think it would make more sense that she actually starts considering Legolas as a partner because he's very supportive of her and her decisions. He goes with her. He defies his father for her. And tries to find himself in the same way that she's trying to, quote-unquote, find herself. He almost seems like a much closer and much of a better character, like, within minutes. I know they're separate movies, but the movies take place basically like back to back, so it almost makes no sense why the change has happened. But it's a huge improvement of the character because he's closer to what I know him as in Lord of the Rings, and I just hate the way he is in the second movie. I don't recognize him at all. It pisses me off, and it's one of those times where I can't do that thing that I try to tell you to do when watching these movies, which is divorce yourself from the Lord of the Rings movies. I have a really hard time doing that when it comes to Legolas because he's basically there as a Lord of the Rings character. He is not in the books. He's only there because he's from Lord of the Rings. And to be honest, I have a hard time doing that with all the characters that are like that in these movies. Like Elrond, it's hard for me to not think about Lord of the Rings, so I wish he wasn't in the movie. It's hard for me to not think about Lord of the Rings when it comes to Saruman. I wish he wasn't in the movie. I wish that whole plotline with Sauron, if it was to be done, was done in a much more subtle. I just wish that it wasn't trying its hardest to overthrow the main plot of the movie with how important it is. You know, like that feels like it takes away from what the core element of the movie is, which is the adventure that we're going on with the dwarves and Bilbo. I think Desolation of Smaug is probably the biggest offender in that area, because there's a whole hell of a lot of scenes dedicated to Gandalf being at Dol Guldur, being against Sauron. The extended, again, you didn't realize this because I guess it had been a while since you'd seen the movies, but I could spot this like it was night and day. The extended scenes that they added with Thorin's dad and Dol Guldur, all it did was make the scenes that I dislike longer. It added nothing, especially because it was never brought up again, that the fact that Thorin's dad was alive this whole time and, like, I guess running around the Darkness Temple of where Sauron was, which they also never explained how he got there. They did nothing to make that compelling or interesting. It just felt he literally wasn't in scenes that he was supposed to be in while Gandalf was in Dol Guldur that made the theatrical cut. They couldn't bother to add him into theatrical cut scenes that he was supposed to be in those action scenes in Dol Guldur. If you ever go back and watch this movie, try to look for this, because it is so obvious that all they had to do was add him in to like a small cut of the scene, and he wasn't there. It's so obvious which scenes are extended and which scenes aren't. Because they didn't even bother to mesh them together well in a way that makes sense.
I want to talk about Lake Town and the Master of Lake Town and why that whole subplot is annoying. Because again, there's just a lot of like it was either added or just expanded upon in a way that ended up making it take too long. So like for one, the Master of Lake Town is just the worst. He's so annoying. He's over the top but not funny. His character does have a little thematic relevance in that he's greedy, and greed is a theme, but we already have plenty of discourse about greed and gold, so it's just like an annoying character who's doing stuff that's already being done by less annoying characters. Just having him sit there and talk with his butler about how, like, he is so over the top, the writing for him, where he's like, oh, the poor people, disgusting. I couldn't give less of a damn about them. It's like, wow, really great commentary on, like, class whatever, nailed that one. And then his rivalry with, like, Bard is really dumb, because, so Bard comes in and he brings some fish, right? And the fish scene is a good example of what I'm talking about, where I say there is an element of adventure, but it feels like a drunk D&D adventure, because I can see if I was drunk and playing D&D, I would say, okay, so what if I have to roll a persuasion check to get them to not dump out the barrels of fish, which reveals where the rest of the party is hiding? Like, I could totally see myself saying that.
Yeah.
But this is not D&D. This is like a 100, 200, whatever $1 million movie. He brings in the fish, right? And the idea of him bringing the fish, like, he threatens, like, hey, if I don't bring in this and people don't have food, they're going to be mad. I can kind of get behind that. But based on that one scene, which is an interaction that he has with just the butler guy, I forget what his name is. I call
Alfred.
him Shitty Wormtongue. Alfred. Based on that one scene with Alfred, it's later taken to the Master of Lake Town that he's like a leader and a troublemaker, right? So that's something that is told to you, but never really established in his interactions with the common people. They do this a little better in the third movie, where he actually leads common people. But in this movie, we don't get that part. So the rivalry between Bard and the Master of Lake Town is dumb, because that one little detail is just kind of shoved in there that, oh, he's inspiring to the common people, and that could make him a troublemaker. Now, I will say, the trap that he sets with basically having Bard look like the bad guy in the situation, whereas like he's trying to help the dwarves and how that would benefit everyone, that is a little bit of a clever trap, in my opinion. Like, I kind of thought that scene was okay, but he doesn't really do anything leaderly, so the setup for it is pretty weak. And therefore it creates a rivalry that, even though it has kind of a clever payoff, doesn't really leave that much of an impression.
The whole setup with the master and the shitty Wormtongue guy, and the one guy that the town looks up to, kind of, but he has no power, so they're all being oppressed by this big rich guy who's in charge. It's a very cliche premise to begin with, and they don't really do anything to add to that conversation. Like it's not that it's not an important subject matter in like today's times or throughout history. There has always been rich people that oppress the poor and the common folk, but it's not really a thread that they ever pull on or do anything interesting with. It's just there to again to represent that theme of greed, which we have plenty of, and we really had no need to have more of that shoved down our throat.
So let's get to the end,
Well,
or
let's
the
real quick.
final part.
I want to talk about some things I did like about the movie because I've been spending a
Well,
lot
I
of
was
time.
I was about to say the same thing, which is the scene where Bilbo meets Smaug is great.
Right, well, yeah. Real quick before we get to Smaug, I actually like the beginning of this movie. The beginning of this movie is what I think tricks me every time into thinking that I really like this movie, because I like the meetup with Thorin and Bree, kind of going over what we already know, but giving us like a little bit more of a backstory as to why this adventure was created and what Thorin's goals are and what Gandalf's goals are. I like I like the forest scene. It's very close to how it was in the book, right up until they meet the elves. I remember this line. I always really liked this line from this movie where Bilbo is talking about coming into his own to Gandalf, and he's like, "Gandalf, I found something in the Goblin tunnels." And Gandalf's like, "What did you find?" And Bilbo's kind of thumbing with the ring, and he goes, "My courage." Like for a second, you think he's going to talk about the ring, and then he does that quick deflection to like him growing as a person, and Gandalf totally not buying it. I thought that scene was done well. I think the spider scene in general was pretty well done. It up until the elves arrive and save them, I really like how disoriented they are. I think that it was pretty clever. Show like Bilbo looking down, thinking he's walking forward, but like his feet are walking backward was kind of a clever trick. The disorientation that the dwarves experience in general, I think, was pretty well executed. So I really like a lot of the beginning of this movie, even the bear scene. Like I don't love the bear scene like I love the spider scenes or the woods and anything like that, but I don't think it takes too much away.
I do have one quick thing about the very beginning, which is it's not a huge problem, but again, I'm entitled to be a nitpicky asshole sometimes. The setup that they're trying to go for, I feel like, seems a little contrived in the sense of there were bandits that just happened to have like a coded message in the black speech of Mordor handy. Why would any human bandit ever have that?
Do you mean like why they were running in the beginning?
No, like he says he has this thing that's in the black speech, right? Why would they have that? Like how would he have gotten a hold of that in that situation?
I'm forgetting the scene. Who has this?
When Gandalf, when he shows Thorin that what is it?
Oh, right. That he's telling him he's being hunted. They wants him dead. Yeah.
Yeah, there were assassins that were coming after Thorin with a message written in black speech. Have you ever known orcs to hire human bounty hunters?
Yeah, I did find it a little odd that like humans were about to come jump Thorin. Like it was the only time in the entire trilogy we see someone that isn't an orc trying to kill him.
Yeah, like what the fuck?
Yeah, that was anyway,
a little odd. That's a minor point, but I just thought it was funny.
Also, something I forgot to mention that I think was a strength of the first movie, a strength of the original Lord of the Rings movies, and a flaw in the second movie in particular, less of a flaw in the third movie, but still kind of a flaw, is that the Lord of the Rings movies and the first Hobbit movie understood that the magic in the Middle-earth universe is very subtle. It's not overt. Gandalf is not shooting laser beams out of his staff like he's Goku, you know? A scene that I really loved in the first movie that I forgot to mention was when Gandalf saves them all from the trolls. He doesn't like cast a spell or use a blinding light or anything like he does with the goblins. He just thrusts his staff down on a rock and splits it in half and lets the sun shine on them. I love that because that to me encapsulates the subtlety of the magic that exists in Middle Earth. That he would do stuff like that in Lord of the Rings. He literally, in the iconic Balrog scene where he breaks the bridge, all he's doing is thrusting his staff onto the bridge and breaking it so that the Balrog falls, you know? To me, the first movie nailed that, and this movie just completely missed the mark with him having the fucking sorcerer battle with Sauron and all the orcs and shit. And it's less egregious in the third film, but also still very egregious when, you know, like the Avengers show up to help Gandalf in that scene and like all the shit that's going on. It's cool in theory, but seeing all the magic fly, we'll get to that more in the third movie. But I feel like the second movie is like the biggest offender in that area where it just kind of uses magic however the hell it wants, especially when it comes to Gandalf and like what he can do, you know. So I almost, to me, when you were saying that you didn't like Gandalf being afraid of Beorn, I almost liked that Gandalf felt like they were in peril because I don't like the idea that Gandalf's magic can just kind of MacGuffin them out of any situation. Like
That is fair, and I mean a part of the reason the story is how it is. I mean, even going back to the original book, is getting Gandalf away from the group was necessary to create more tense situations that they would have to solve.
yeah, yeah.
I just think it's funny that in a situation where Gandalf's there, it's like I think Gandalf could take a bear, like if he had to.
Yeah, I agree, but I also like that there was that Gandalf being afraid made me feel like there were stakes, even if I believe a wizard could take a bear. You know.
No, that's fair. All right,
But-
we got to get done with the second movie at some point because we have so much
Yeah.
to get through.
Now we have to get into what tricked me as a 15, 16-year-old to believe that this was my favorite movie, and that is that they, despite missing the mark on so many things surrounding him, they fucking nailed Smaug.
Smaug is great.
Awesome. He is epic. He is the best part of the movie, hands down. He's one of the best parts of the entire trilogy. And he tricked me into believing this was the best movie of the trilogy because he's that damn good. His voice, his presence, the size, the scene with him and Bilbo is just as good as Riddles in the Dark. It's one of those high quality scenes that I think can be talked about among like the Lord of the Rings scenes, where him and Bilbo are just talking. It does kind of feel like it's like directly ripped from the book, so much so that like it doesn't really feel like Bilbo talks that way normally throughout the movie.
Well, yeah, but I think he's pretending like he's like code switching.
Yes, and that's kind of the excuse I give for, even though I always think that at first. I'm like, I don't really remember Bilbo really talking like this throughout the movies, but he is pretending, he is playing like almost a character in that moment, so that makes sense. But that's part of the reason why that scene is so damn good. I love seeing Smaug move. I love seeing the gold fly off of him. Everything he does, every scene he's in, he improves because he is just so awesome. They nailed Smaug.
And obviously, it's all CGI, and you can sort of debate. There are moments of great looking effects in this. There are moments of not great looking effects in this. But
Yeah.
one thing I do like is, you know, I've joked in the past about how could One Piece ever pay off with a treasure big enough to be worth like the 40 years that they've been searching for it or whatever. You see this treasure that's being built up, you really feel like this is like a reality warping bounty that they have found here. I mean, the whole room is just full of gold like it's an ocean. It looks pretty cool.
Also, talk about weird choices to make while filming this movie. Completely forgot to mention that there's a few cuts interspersed throughout the barrel scene where they literally used a GoPro just attached to the barrel, and it's so goddamn noticeable. It bothers me every time to see the frame rate dip as much as it does on a GoPro like that. I have no idea why they chose to do that. That is one of the most baffling decisions I've ever seen a movie make ever. Like, what the hell? Was there like a promotion they had to do with GoPro? Like the GoPro people to like, I don't know, the application of a GoPro? Because to me, all it did was make me not want a GoPro because it looked so unlike a movie. Anyways, back to Smaug.
No, I agree. The positivity kind of takes a dip because the climax of this movie is not great.
I like it, but go on.
It's a thing where the tension is kind of being taken away by how much the dwarves survive. Smaug frequently does things that are kind of dumb, like the scene where the dwarves split up and yell at him from different places, and he constantly chases after the most recent one he heard from, like he's a cat chasing red dots. Like, you're a sentient creature. You have to know they're playing you somehow. Don't let them bait you. Just, like, wait them out. Starve them. Something. The encasing him in gold thing, the science is faulty, but I'm going to try to put that aside and just say it's kind of a funny idea, And the dwarves do have kind of this creative spirit where even though none of them are like geniuses, except like Balin's like smart or whatever, he's like the archivist and the history guy and stuff. But the dwarves do have this thing where they kind of have that ability to come up with clever ways to get out of these situations. So them coming up with something like that is kind of interesting. The effects do not look good. It looks like melting butter, which is a shame. And then, well, here I'll say my last thing about Smog right now because it kind of ties directly. And the biggest thing, though, the problems that I have with this movie are the ungodly amount of filler. And then, as kind of a secondary function of that, basically not a single character in this movie has a meaningful arc. Bilbo stays the exact same because his arc was already resolved in the first movie. He learned how to be brave and adventurous. And he resolved his tension with Thorin because Thorin recognized that he was being brave and adventurous on behalf of him and his kin. So that's all done. Thorin does accomplish his mission, kind of, but that is not fully realized until the next movie. So Thorin doesn't really progress. Nothing for Bard, really. Nothing for Gandalf. No one in this movie has a character arc. And it's not a great thing for a movie when it's like that.
Yeah, I liked the climax. I think that even though it does suffer from a lot of the same problems where it's like they're made of rubber and that there's no one's really in danger, I think that the only time that kind of worked was when they're up against a dragon. I do think it's a little dumb that they were like doing that thing where they were calling his name, but a lot of that scene was really extreme in the way that like they had to really pull out all the stops to defend themselves against this impossible threat. Do I think it's dumb that he's like fire breathing right at them and they're only protected by pillars and like they're fine? Yes. Do I think it's dumb that Thorin basically uses a metal wheelbarrow to surf on melted gold? Yes, that's super dumb. He would be burning. But I like the operating the machinery, the fact that they had to trick Smaug into reactivating the forges to enact their plan. Bilbo having to pour water on Smaug to get it so that he doesn't flame everybody in the room. I also think that a lot of the reason why Smaug isn't just decimating them right away is explained in the way that he toys with the dwarves pretty often. Like, Smaug is not threatened by them in the least, and he makes that pretty clear. And I think that it's pretty obvious that throughout the climax, he's not taking this seriously. He feels like he could end them at any moment, and it's kind of just toying with them the whole time. And once it becomes too much of a nuisance to actually deal with them, he basically just goes, "Well, I'm just gonna go kill the people that sent you here. I'm gonna you're not gonna pull one over me. I may not have been taking you seriously this whole time, but there was that moment where they almost got him, where they poured him with gold," which I think that scene was a direct homage from the book. Because in the book, when they meet Smaug and when he leaves the mountain to go attack Lake Town, he's supposed to be covered in gold. I believe he had spent so long sleeping and rolling around in the gold that they actually like meshed with him, because he's this dragon that's just literally stuck head to toe in pieces of gold, right? They couldn't do that design wise in a movie because I don't think that would work nearly as well. I don't even know if it fully worked in the book. I'd have to reread it, but I don't think that would work in the movie. I think directly adapting that to the movie would have been a hindrance. But I feel like their subtle nod to that by burying him in gold, melted gold, and then having that scene where he flies out of the mountain covered in gold and like whips it all off of him in the night sky, which was a great shot, by the way. I think that was a really cool homage to the book. And I really like the cliffhanger. The cliffhanger is another reason why I was tricked into thinking that this was my favorite Hobbit movie. Let me rephrase that. I liked the cliffhanger before the third movie came out. I liked it because I had assumed that the cliffhanger suggested that a lot of the third movie was going to be focused on them defending the village against Smaug. Like all of them. I know this didn't happen in the book, and I was concerned because I had read the book and I had known that the scene isn't very long where Smaug attacks the village and then gets killed by Bard. That scene's not very long, but they've added already a ton of stuff to the movies that I was hoping that maybe they would add a huge hour-long fight scene with the dwarves, Bilbo, everybody in Lake Town against Smaug. And I thought that would be pretty epic. I was a little concerned when they revealed the title was Battle of the Five Armies, because I was like, well, that doesn't sound like they're going to be focusing very much at all on Smaug. That almost sounds like we're already supposed to expect that Smaug is going to die because the focus is not on Smaug. But initially, that cliffhanger happening and that ending really hit me, because I was like, holy shit, like, this suggests to me that this is going to be a huge and epic payoff in the next movie. So I initially really liked that ending. I still like that ending for that feeling that it first gives you. It's definitely been lessened. It's almost like Across the Spider-Verse. Like, I really like the ending of Across the Spider-Verse for that same reason, but I'm hoping that payoff is sufficient enough to keep me liking that as much as I do with the third movie. I don't feel like that happened in the third movie. We'll get to that probably right now. But it's still a feeling that I remember and I look back on fondly, that moment hitting me, thinking like, holy shit, they've just unleashed a dragon onto that village, and we're not going to know the payoff to that for a year. And so I really like the beginning of this movie with the spiders. I love Smaug. I think he's incredible. I like the climax, even though I recognize it's silly and that not everything about it is great. But everything surrounding those scenes in this movie is just so trash. Like, there's just so many shit.
Yeah, the middle of this movie is pretty garbage.
The middle of this movie is rough. It's like a whole good hour of this movie is just rough to get through. And I had forgotten just how rough it was. My teenage brain was really forgiving on that at the time. And it's incredible to me that when I first started rewatching these movies, I was really excited to rewatch Desolation of Smaug because I thought it was my favorite one. And coming out of this rewatch, it's definitely my least favorite one. And I think that's just crazy. All right. And now we cap off our review of this trilogy with probably the most contentious movie of the bunch for us, I'm guessing.
Yes. So you, sir, I believe your comment was, I was waiting to hate the Battle of Five Armies, and I never did.
Yes, and let me elaborate. Similarly to my initial thoughts on Smaug being completely wrong to how I feel now, Battle of the Five Armies was borderline unwatchable when I first saw it. I saw it in theaters, hated what felt like every moment past the 12-minute mark when Smaug died, and I never wanted to watch it again, and I never did up until recently. There was so much I didn't like about this film. There was some things that I kind of like was okay with, like Thorin and Bilbo's relationship. I thought that was done well, but that it was still surrounded by a crap movie. To me, most of it, when I first watched it, was pretty unwatchable, and I really had no desire to watch it ever again. That's how much I didn't like this movie. So, with that benefit of hindsight, rewatching it this time around, and realizing that this movie was nowhere near as bad as I initially thought it was, and it was definitely watchable, was surprising to me, and gave it a lot of goodwill and validation upon my rewatch. So much so that I think it's my second favorite Hobbit movie of the trilogy. It's not amazing. I wouldn't say it's as good as the first one. I'd say it's better than the second one quite handily, but there's definitely a lot of those flaws that the second one had in this movie, like the love triangle, which we'll get into. I think that Smaug only lasting about 12 minutes was initially what really upset me about this film, and what kind of put a bad taste in my mouth when watching it the first time. Because again, with that cliffhanger of Desolation of Smaug, I was expecting the Battle of Lake Town and Smaug decimating it to be a huge focus of this film. And it literally was resolved in the first 12 minutes, and that really pissed me off. Putting that expectation aside, with this rewatch 10 years later, I found that it was actually a lot more enjoyable. And there was a lot of things that I ignored upon that watch that, when watching here, I actually found to really enjoy. Again, I remember thinking that I liked Bilbo and Thorin's relationship and the way that it degraded, and then how Thorin redeemed himself later. I liked it on my first rewatch, but I didn't like it enough to actually think this movie had any pros. This rewatch really liked that plot element. I thought, especially when watching the movies back to back, it enhanced the way that I felt about these two characters, because I have been through this journey with them in the last 6 days, all the way through, and to see the way that it played out in this movie, it really drew me in, and I cared so much more about what was going on in this movie than I did before. And that's the biggest surprise to me, is that When I first watched this movie, I did not give a shit about what was going on. I did not care at all. There was nothing bringing me in and interesting me. I cared a lot more on this watch, and I think part of the reason why that is because instead of waiting for this movie for a year, I watched all 3 movies back to back, and that really enriched the experience for me when watching these characters go through all this peril and dealing with all the things that happen in this movie. Now, you tear it down.
Yeah, so I watched this movie in theaters when it came out, thought it kind of sucked. Hadn't watched it or barely thought about it since. And I was really curious how I'd feel. There was a window of time when I actually thought I was going to have to kind of admit defeat on this one. Because the beginning of the movie actually has some solid stuff. I do feel like, even though the climax, or the not climax, cliffhanger in the second movie was kind of good, I feel like maybe they should have just defeated Smaug then and found another plot hook.
Definitely.
Because it just seems really weird that they basically just have like the aftermath of the second movie and then it just kind of rolls straight into the third movie. It's weird. But Thorin and Bilbo's relationship is actually a good part of the beginning because, and Bilbo throughout this movie I think has a lot of good character stuff because he, by this point, even though there's still a problem of he's not the main character for more than half the movie, he is able to, I think, exercise his agency in a way that's a little more interesting. Like, he's not just preventing the dwarves from being imprisoned or, trying to, like, help them, stop them from dying. He's making, like, moral decisions, like taking the Arkenstone to Thranduil and Gandalf. And stuff like that I think is good. And so there was some point where I was like, hey, yeah, this movie's not as bad as I remember. It's still got too much Lord of the Rings callbacks, but there's some stuff that it's trying to do. And then the Battle of the Five Armies starts. And I was surprised because it was like, hey, we're at the battle. I thought maybe this would be boring until the battle, but this has actually been okay. Maybe this movie's not too bad. The Battle of the Five Armies is a fucking joke. Okay, so, but I'll get to that in a second. Let's talk about some more Lord of the Rings callbacks, because look, I'm not gonna sit here and act like I'm above seeing Saruman, Elrond, and Galadriel square up to Sauron and the Ring Wraiths. Isn't kind of cool, but it doesn't work well pacing-wise, because we're basically on, like, our second super high-stakes battle in, like, half an hour. And it doesn't work in the broader timeline, because as we've discussed, the fact that Sauron is here now makes no sense. Why is he declaring himself when he doesn't have the ring? And knows, just like everyone knows, that makes him vulnerable. Why does no one ever bother to follow up with Saruman for the next several decades about what happened that day? The Nazgul go from being really cool and intimidating kind of figures of presence to basically being video game NPCs. It's not great. But also, here's a question that has no answer that I can recall. If Sauron is present and is capable of being, like, perceiving the world right now, how the fuck does he not already start tracking the ring when Bilbo puts it on?
Yes, I completely agree.
It doesn't make any fucking sense.
There
is no defined limit on that. There is no defined, like, capacity that he has to be at in order to do this. Why the fuck does he not already know where the ring is?
Yes, and
or at least that it's out there and that he needs to start looking for it.
Battle of the Five Armies is pretty close to being just as bad of an offender as Desolation of Smaug in the sense of how it treats Sauron and his character. You know what? We actually we differ here. I don't like the scene where Elrond and Galadriel and Saruman are all coming out and lightsaber dueling with the fucking Nazgul and all that shit. I think that's so egregious and over the top, and everything, again, what I was saying earlier about the subtleties of magic in the Middle-earth universe, it's just like they're fucking hitting bolts and fucking D&D wizards and shit, like flinging fireball and scorching ray, and it's just so over the top and egregious, and it does not at all feel like a scene we should be looking at in a Middle-earth movie. A movie with so much established magic subtleties. Like, I get that it, like, in theory is cool, but it takes away so much from... It doesn't even really feel like it's a Lord of the Rings or Hobbit scene. It feels more like a Marvel scene than it does something from Middle-earth.
Also, again, I just want to ask, why the fuck does Sauron care about any of this? Like, Is he at his current level of power afraid of the dragon? Because if he is, then why does he have to care? Just ignore Erebor entirely. And if he's not, then why would he be investing in stopping Thorin unless he also wants the gold? But Sauron doesn't need gold. What does he need to finance the war? Do you think Mordor was like paying its orcs? Why does he need gold? Why does he give a shit about any of this?
Well,
Like that's what I'm saying the problem is like so much of the movie is built around Sauron
so
in a way that just makes no sense.
I agree. It is implied in the extended edition, the keyword there, extended edition of
Which I did
Desolation of
watch,
Smaug.
so I'm curious what you're about to say.
It's implied that Smaug and Sauron are actually working together, even though there's never a scene that shows this, nor does it make any sense. Thorin's dad says to Gandalf that he does not want Thorin to go to Erebor because there's dark forces there more so than just the dragon. That the Dark Lord has his eye on it, and he's been in cahoots with Smaug. He doesn't directly say that, but it's implied that that's what's happening.
Right, but how does that profit either of them?
It doesn't. It doesn't make any sense. It's stupid. And
Like,
I prefer that to not be the case.
yeah, I mean, Smaug has the gold, and Sauron doesn't give a shit about worldly treasures or a dragon. Like, unless he wants to use the dragon to attack Minas Tirith, why does he care about any of this shit?
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense.
Okay, but so now let's all every moment Alfred's on screen, I want to die. It's just terrible. He just shouldn't be in the movie. He should have died at the beginning with the Master. I just get rid of him.
I think it was a good choice to have the Master die. I didn't want to see him anymore.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. Alfred should have just died with him. Just get out of the movie. He's terrible. I feel like so like I said, there is a positive thing here about the relationship between Thorin and Bilbo and Thorin's descent. But I'm curious what your thoughts on this are. I do feel like the movie kind of ends up, again, I don't know what this was like in the book. I feel like one of the ways that the movie's unintentionally kind of making itself like bootleg Lord of the Rings is I really like the idea of the corrupting influence of this treasure until they stress like really hard that it's like a physiological condition, like a disease,
Dragon's
rather
Cord?
than just the net. What?
Dragon's Gold or whatever Balin says.
Yeah, dragon sickness or gold
Yeah.
sickness, something like that. So rather than just having it be like a natural phenomenon, it's given like a specific condition. And that to me just makes it feel like it's like a shitty version of the Ring, which never, I mean, they don't have a name like ring sickness or whatever, but it just feels like something that would make more sense if it was more implied rather than something that like existed in its own way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do think that if that had been given more focus, I don't think that it was explicitly stated or even implied that it was a physical condition. I think maybe that there has just been times throughout history in Middle Earth. Again, I don't know this, but what I was getting from that is that there had been times throughout history in Middle Earth where great heroes had won against a dragon who had hordes of gold, and that had changed them. Like having that much gold and having that much power after conquering the dragon had then changed them and turned them into lesser of what they were. And that had happened enough times that they had given it a name, which would be dragon sickness or whatever it was called. I didn't really get the impression that it was a literal like sickness, like a disease. But what I did get that impression from, and what I wasn't as into, was the Arkenstone being that. Like, that the Arkenstone itself was something that was basically just like a discount one ring. Because Smaug references it in the second movie, that he almost wants to give Thorin the Arkenstone to watch it take him over and watch it corrupt his soul. And the idea that the Arkenstone is just another one ring, I thought was kind of lame and lazy. But that as well isn't really given as much focus, nor is it like given as much credence, because Thorin is suffering from his character change without the Arkenstone. So the idea that the Arkenstone is what causes this in people is actually kind of disproven in this movie, because it's Bilbo who has the Arkenstone, and at no point is Thorin actually like holding it or it affecting him physically. It's just his want for it that's driving him mad. So while I do think that there are times where they mention things like that make it feel like it's just a discount one ring or it's stupid, the way they actually executed the idea, I thought, was pretty smart and well done. And it removes Thorin enough from these things that they're stating that he's going through, it's almost kind of up in the air whether or not you want to believe that's what's happening to him, whether or not he's suffering from dragon sickness, whether or not he's being driven mad by the Arkenstone, or if he is just going mad himself. I think there's enough ambiguity around it that you kind of don't really know what's going on with him, which is what raises the interest for me about the whole situation. Because it's not just him and Bilbo that are suffering. It's specifically him and all the dwarves. The scene where he freaks out because he thinks he sees Bilbo holding the Arkenstone and it's just an acorn, and he kind of has a moment where he's like snapping back a little bit into his old self and really appreciating how Bilbo is and who he is to him, I think is really touching and really well done. And that being followed up with him then distrusting his own kin and only trusting Bilbo, I think, is a smart follow-up to that. And a lot of the way that Thorin progresses in this movie makes sense and is intriguing and interesting. And it makes his redemption around the end, I say end, I think it's like the last hour of the movie, it makes his redemption feel a lot more satisfying, and I care a lot more when he does die at the end of the movie. Thorin, I think, is the MVP of this movie. He becomes the most interesting character throughout and is the one that I care about the most. It was something that I've forgotten about this movie that I found really surprising, how much I ended up liking Thorin as a character and was rooting for him, just even during the times where I wasn't, because he was turning insane.
It's funny, I got a very different impression. I very much was getting the ring vibe, because even though the ring has no name for it like dragon sickness, the ring, it's not like a placebo or whatever. Like, the ring clearly has a defined effect, or at least high chance to have an effect on people, and you know what that effect is. And I felt like they were kind of indicating the same with the dragon sickness, because if you'll remember, it was alluded to that it also affected his grandfather. But yeah, that leads to a problem, because one, again, I just think the idea of defining it rather than just making it like something that, because it's a concept that you as an audience member can already understand, that this amount of greed and this kind of fixation on your goals at the cost of anything else can cause you to lose yourself. It's like if you found out, like, oh, Sasuke has dead parent-itis. It's a condition that makes you really sad when your parents are dead. It's like, no, you don't need to do that, because we already understand like what he's going through without it being assigned like a name and treated like a specific thing. It's more interesting if it's just kind of left for you to emotionally interpret.
Yeah.
But then the second thing I was going to say is, I kind of go the opposite way, where I feel like as the Thorin stuff goes on, I think he starts to just be a little bit cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, and it starts to be a little less compelling. But, so, again, going back to his grandfather, right? His grandfather his grandfather is affected by this same, like, thing that's affecting him, right? They make that pretty clear. He is still fighting to defend Moria in those flashbacks, and yet Thorin is basically willing to embrace his own death in the scene with the one guy when he's sitting in the throne room. What I forget the name of the dwarf that comes in, the one who berates him. Yeah. He's basically willing to accept his own death as long as he dies, like, in the pile of gold. And stuff like that to me just suggests that they're kind of playing the insanity card like a little too hard. Because the other thing too is, like, while I like the idea that maybe he's being a confidant in Bilbo because he doesn't trust the dwarves, I don't really see that it's all that well established that he would believe that it wasn't any of his own kin who he's known a lot longer than Bilbo versus Bilbo, the guy who is literally there to steal stuff. Also the person who was in the room with Smaug alone for an extended period of time. Also the person who constantly is kind of trying to subtly tell him that, like, maybe he needs to calm down a little bit. I just feel like they kind of go a little too hard on that, where it's like, do you really not suspect Bilbo at all? Like, come on.
Well, I think he did suspect Bilbo a lot. Well, this was already established in Desolation of Smaug when he first escaped Smaug, and Thorin immediately asks, "Where's the Arkenstone? Did you find it?" And Bilbo kind of gives him a half answer, and Thorin puts a sword in his way and is like literally about to kill him over the fact that he thinks Bilbo has taken the Arkenstone. So there was a lot of time for Thorin to accuse Bilbo of this, and I think that it does kind of make sense that once he is reminded that Bilbo is like, you know, someone who loves home, and he's not even though yes, he is their burglar, but he was never really a burglar. Like his origins come from like humble comforts and, you know, like armchairs and home. And when he's reminded of that because of the acorn, I think that is a good turning point for Thorin to then put all of his faith in Bilbo, because it makes a lot of sense to me that he might, now that they've completed their quest and all the dwarves are in their home again and they're all like, restored their glory, that maybe Thorin might start thinking that the other dwarves might want to find the Arkenstone and claim themselves to be the king under the mountain over Thorin, because Thorin is paranoid at this point and he's off the deep end. And to your point that they overplay the insanity card in that scene where he's like willing to die with the gold, that to me is not overplayed, because it's the turning point for him after he has that scene with Dwalin, and then he has that psychedelic scene where he's being buried by the gold like Smaug was, and Smaug is in the gold swimming beneath him, and he's hearing all these people saying all these things, and basically it's alluding to him having become Smaug at this point. To me, that insanity, that like super like low point for his character, is what turns him to then redeeming himself. He realizes that this has gone too far and that he has lost himself, and that's the very beginning of him kind of like finding himself again. That's when he goes to the dwarves and tells them, we're going to go out and fight. We're going to go out and help our cousin. And I liked that.
I just feel like, though, the dwarves kind of run into a problem in this movie where almost none of them, except for a handful of moments, get like really any distinct character, anything. Half of them like don't even speak.
Yeah,
it feels like, and so part of that kind of makes me just sort of skeptical about the way they approach that story is literally at no point really that I can think of, especially in like the recent time relative of the movie, or I guess, you know, of the trilogy, has any of the dwarves expressed like an ounce of disloyalty about anything. So the idea that Thorin would suspect any of them seems like it was contrived by the script rather than a natural development of the characters, because by this point there are basically three characters in the party. There's Killy, Thorin, and Bilbo, and that's it. So you're basically at this point, you're just gesturing towards the extras and being like, anyone could have stolen it. And that to me just doesn't feel as compelling, and it doesn't feel like it's naturally built up to. Because again, the evidence and the paranoia, like you're talking about, he's paranoid, right? Like, to me, there's sort of a line that you have to figure out between paranoia and just being insane. Because if you're paranoid, you're going to think with what is in your own mind logical about what's happening. And perhaps you can say, if there's not someone that's like an obvious suspect, which I feel like there is going to create suspects where there aren't any. No one is stolen from you. But in this case, someone did steal from you. And if you're a paranoid person, the degree to which you would suspect the one outsider of the group seems to me like it would be pretty damn high.
Well, I think it was. I think that's why they had that moment, both in the Desolation of Smaug, where he has the sword in between them, and before Smaug interrupts them, it looks like he might kill Bilbo over the idea that he stole it. And in this movie, where he thinks he sees him holding it for a second, and like basically comes up to him and like starts shouting at him until Bilbo has to reveal that it was an acorn that he was looking at. And in that moment, Bilbo reminds him that Bilbo's not there for treasure or for glory. He's, you know, trying to help him find a home. He's trying to get back to his home and remember all the things that have happened in this adventure. And I think that without that scene, I would totally agree with you. But there's scenes that establish Thorin's logic. You know, he suspects everyone, probably suspects Bilbo even more until he realizes that he shouldn't. and has like a moment where he kind of finds himself for a second in appreciating Bilbo as a character, which then feeds into his paranoia of everybody else because he's not having these moments with the other dwarves. All the other dwarves are already kind of suspicious of his behavior and like not really agreeing with the things that he's doing or saying. And real quick, I don't entirely agree with the only focus being on Keely, Thorin, and Bilbo. There is some focus on the other dwarves. It's just lesser. Like Balin being the voice of reason for Thorin and like kind of watching his good friend that he's followed for this entire trilogy turn to madness and him doubting himself and following Thorin because of that. Beaufort, the guy that throughout the trilogy would often Bilbo and him would be kind of awake while all the other dwarves were asleep.
I can't resist.
Hold on. Beaufort and Bilbo.
Beaufort, he's nuts.
Okay.
Can't resist.
Okay.
Continue.
Anyways, Beaufort having that moment with Bilbo as he's like about to leave, kind of telling him that he supports Bilbo in leaving this time, which is a complete contrast to the scene that they had in the first movie where Bilbo is going to leave because he doesn't feel like he belongs, and Beaufort telling him that he does belong and that he feels like they need him to complete their journey. In this movie, they have the exact opposite. When Bilbo's about to leave, he feels guilty for leaving and doesn't really want to, but Beaufort's like, no one can blame you. No one would blame you for wanting to leave now with how the state of how everything's looking. You know, like, you go ahead and I'll let you leave. Like, I'm not going to stop you. That's a very touching scene, especially in contrast with how it was in the first movie.
No, I agree. Those two scenes, those two dwarves do get moments. That's fair.
And there's a big reason why my opinion of this movie improved is because there's a lot of those kinds of scenes that like are like a complete flip of how they were in the first movie. One thing that I noticed on this watch, when Thorin dies, he says to Bilbo, if more people valued home over gold, this world would be a merrier place. And that's a direct reference to Bilbo promising to help these dwarves find their home again. He didn't promise them to help them reclaim their gold. He promised to help them find their home. And part of why everything was going to shit in this movie was because Thorin's obsession over his gold and not him reclaiming his home like he was originally stating he wanted to do. And that was like a big full circle moment for Thorin, having that last moment with Bilbo, which, by the way, the acting in that scene was excellent, absolutely superb, of Bilbo holding Thorin as he's about to die and then like just being stricken with grief and denial as Thorin is passing. But that's that moment where he tells him, like, he acknowledges that like his love for home over gold is what makes Bilbo's character so good and valuable to Thorin. Bilbo, I think, is one of the biggest driving factors of bringing Thorin out of that madness in that way. I think Thorin knows that because they don't really have a moment to talk after Thorin has that redeeming, like, that has that turn where he starts to find himself again up until he's dying. But there is that one moment where Bilbo is coming to warn him. And Bilbo doesn't have any like qualms about their last interaction where Thorin was about to throw him off the cliff and kill him. He just wants to go warn Thorin because he believes Thorin is his friend. And that one interaction where Thorin first sees Bilbo and is like, Bilbo, like he's so happy to see him and see that he's okay. And then they get interrupted, and then their last interaction with each other is as Thorin's dying. And it's very touching. I think it's a very emotional. The arc that closes their relationship there it wrenches at the heart. It calls back to a lot of the establishing scenes between them in the first movie. I know it was already something that I thought was a positive of this movie, but it was astounding to me how much I liked it this time around. And I think a big reason why it hit so hard with me is because of how quickly in succession I watched these movies this time around, rather than waiting for 2 years to see it in theaters. You know, like, I think watching these movies back to back really enhances the experience, and that I think is a big part of the reason why my mind has changed on specifically this movie and how much, like, what I felt about it. You know, do you feel like watching these movies back to back enhanced the experience whatsoever?
In that particular sense, yeah, for sure. That would be probably the biggest driver, is because the relationship mostly between Thorin and Bilbo was sort of feeling very fresh, and seeing it kind of play out in its totality gave me, I think, a good perspective for it.
Something I want to touch on that you mentioned a little bit earlier in this video was that you thought the actual Battle of the Five Armies sucked. I think that there are parts of it that drag on too long and aren't great, but there are parts of it that I really liked. Like, one thing that I really actually enjoyed was the beginning when the elves and the dwarves first started fighting. I really like that the elves did their typical arrow firing on the entire army of the dwarves, and the dwarves had a perfect counter for that. That was basically just 2 or 4 giant like spears with like a stick swinging off them to knock all the arrows out of the way, and then hit the elves with their own spears. That felt like it made so much sense to me. Dwarves and elves have been fighting for centuries, and it made complete sense to me that the dwarves would have come up with their own machinery to counter the elves specifically. And that was something that I didn't even remember happened, so I really enjoyed that this time around.
I thought that was fucking stupid.
Well, come on, why? That makes perfect sense.
Because that is one of those things. It's like the problem of the Star Wars prequels having better technology than the original trilogy. If that shit existed, that's getting copied by everyone everywhere. Arrows are useless in the Lord of the Rings universe now. It's over. You should never fire another volley of arrows ever again.
Well, I think...
This shouldn't happen. You shouldn't do it.
The dwarves are very experienced builders. So there's a...
Okay, I knew you were going to say that, but there are plenty of other, like, mechanized things that do not get built by the dwarves. Like the ballistas at the Battle of Helm's Deep. They make giant crossbows anyway.
Yeah, but to me, that's like a giant spear that can, at the same time, destroy a volley of arrows while attacking your enemies. Seems like it would be a pretty complicated thing to make for an army. There's a lot of things going into that. I feel like the spears being able to perfectly land where you want your targets to go when they have this giant stick swinging off of it. That seems like...
okay, so that's the other thing. I'm sorry, I don't mean to pick at the science too much, but I have to in this case, just because it's like, that is like again, I stand by it, that is like a universe-breaking weapon that, like, breaks the story. There is no fucking way that from, like, several hundred yards away, you are timing that shot to perfectly match the trajectory to take out every single arrow that's flying in your direction. Just, that requires, like... you know how Spider-Man, they say that, like, he's so smart that he can, like, figure out all of the angular trajectories of his web swings, and that's part of the reason why he's able to do what he does and other people can't? You would need, like, that to figure out, like, okay, if I fire this at this time, and the wind conditions are this, and the angle is this, then that means that if I fire 3.2 seconds after they do, I'll get the exact right... No, fuck off.
I think that if anybody could do it, it would be the dwarves. And it would make sense that it would be the dwarves because of they're revered for building mechanisms that are more complicated and more efficient than any other race. And they also are the direct rivals of the elves. So it makes sense to me that the dwarves would have something that directly counter the elves like that only they could build.
Then they should have conquered the world.
First of all, the dwarves don't want to conquer the world. Second of all, the dwarves don't have an army in the Lord of the Rings. We don't see a dwarven army, so it would make sense to me that there aren't anything like that in the Lord of the Rings movies.
Well, there would be an army if they were smart enough to take that to more battles.
But what if it's only a dwarf that can operate it with that precision, like you were saying?
Okay, yeah, I guess if the one guy who invented it died, then they're fucked. Okay, fine, whatever.
Okay, we disagree on that.
But the funny thing is, that's, like, not maybe even in the top 10 dumbest things in the Battle of Five Armies.
Well, go ahead. Fire away.
Okay, so... Jeez, where do I start? Just, there's so many scenes of just absolute fuckery. Why do the elves jump over the dwarves when standing behind shields with their bows and arrows is, like... obviously the tactically correct move? I mean, they clearly know this, own shield guys to cover their archers like 2 minutes prior. This was one of the things that I realized was better because I figured this out. That scene with the arrows, the giant arrow destroyers, is an extended edition thing. Because the dwarves and elves do not ever fight in the original cut. The orcs arrive before they actually meet. Like, before they physically clash.
Oh, no wonder why I didn't remember that.
So that's why I didn't remember that either. But they very clearly know that jumping over the shields when you have bows and arrows is a dumb idea. So
Yeah, that
just
was
just
dumb.
just stuff like that. Why did they cut off the feet of that giant troll that they were riding? That would make it less effective in combat because it would be very easy to trip, which I'm surprised no one did. There's just so much fucking nonsense, like that scene where one of the dwarves like heads is like stuck to the orc or whatever, and he's like,
Oh yeah.
what the fuck was that? What the fuck was up with that scene where you were seeing the one orc like hobble with no legs? What the fuck? The worms should just win the battle.
Oh
Like
yeah.
they should just lay three of those down across the battlefield and wipe out everyone. And it just seems like from the arrows to the action to the creatures they create, it just seems like a movie that was so obsessed with having an epic battle that it just stopped giving a single fuck about the story or about like any consistency in the universe. And if there's a case for me that makes this one worse than Smog, and I don't know which one I think is worse, but if there's a case for me, it's that Smog at least felt like a movie. Not a great movie, but a movie. This is indistinguishable from a video game cutscene because it's all CGI and it's most of it's not super impressive, honestly. And there's just so much stuff happening that doesn't mean anything because these are factions. Half these factions are ones that either you don't care about or you don't know. I compare it to something like Avengers Endgame, right? Like, yeah, the end of Avengers Endgame is a big CGI battle, but there are so many people and so many like factions and organizations that you've spent time with that you still do kind of care about what happens to them if you're a fan of the franchise. Here, these dwarves are dwarves that you're meeting literally for the first time. They just showed up. Thranduil's just been a dick the whole movie. You're not really rooting for him. The orcs are obviously evil, which, by the way, why the fuck can the orcs just walk around in sunlight in these movies with no consequences? That was very clearly set up that they do not like walking into the sun and that they need a cover of dark clouds to move across open ground. They just completely fucking abandon that in these movies. Just again, it just to me it just feels like a video game cutscene where like there is not really much thought put into building a narrative and having it make sense and be governed by a set of rules. So that's my biggest problem. And also the way that Alfred dies is just I just
So
if just like the barrels thing, like these movies have just been just like leaning into this harder. If these movies were not stylized like Lord of the Rings, I don't think I'd care as much. I'd probably find it more amusing. But these movies want to be epic, respected works of fantasy cinema while also being full of the dumbest shit imaginable, and it just doesn't work.
things I do agree with you. The worms are stupid. If there's something that when you were saying that all armies should use those like arrow nullifying spears, I don't agree with that. But the fact that the orcs never use those worms again to win all their battles doesn't make any sense to me. Those worms were like it's stupid if they exist that they didn't just win with those. I One thing that I want to point out though is that in this movie, the reason why I like it a lot more than like a pretty handily over Smog is because you mentioned that the Desolation of Smog kind of feels like a movie, but you also said when we were talking about it that it was a movie where no character has any arcs. No character progresses, no character has any movement, nothing happens to any characters in that movie that matter. I would argue that a video game cutscene where the characters have arcs that we care about is better than a movie that doesn't have any of that. I don't necessarily agree with your take that this is just one big video game cutscene, but if I did, I would still like it more because in this video game cutscene, quote unquote, the characters are going through things that I care about. They have arcs that make sense and are meaningful to me, and the characters, crucially, the way I feel, are making decisions that make sense to me, which I feel like very much lacked in the Desolation of Smog.
No, okay, that's fair. I mean,
And
I can see what you mean. The one other thing, I don't want to be that guy, but given how long this battle goes, how the fuck are there any Iron Hills dwarves left? I mean, they should all have died like 20 minutes ago, but you still see them. They're still out there kicking butt. It's like, no, you guys lost. Like, it's over. I mean, at least with Thranduil, they kind of acknowledge that he got like his army got annihilated. The dwarf, haha, yeah. I mean, we suffered 90% losses, but who cares? So we should start wrapping this up. But there's like, given that the Battle of Five Armies is so long, I have to do this in 2 sittings because we have to talk about the second round of battles up on the Ravens Hill or whatever it's called. Look, I understand that it's rock or stone, whatever, and it's probably really old. But that tower that Legolas fights on is the scene of some insane stuff. For one, the fact that he drives the troll into it so perfectly that it creates a bridge. Second, they break through it like butter. Like, a guy falling from the height that one of the orcs fell just shatters straight through it. It's like, no, he's landing on that and breaking his back. Again, I know it's old, but it's stone. And then the famous anti-gravity Legolas.
Oh, it's the stupidest moment in the movie.
Jesus.
As much as I enjoyed this movie more this time around, that scene came up and I was like, oh, garbage. Complete trash.
Just you gotta stop at some point. Also, one thing I thought was funny is what's the other one's name? Blorg? Bolg. They killed the absolute hell out of Bolg. Stabbed him vertically through the head, sent him falling to his death, hitting the ground, and then have a giant boulder crush him after he'd already hit the ground, which was after he already was killed.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus.
Yeah, no, he's fucking dead.
I said that Azog, like I said, just boring. I said he kind of reminds me of Steppenwolf, and you disagreed with me about this when I said this. Because if you dangle the real big bad too much before the main antagonist of the actual movie, I just do feel like you nerf his threat level, and the payoff of defeating him is not as good because the message is sent to the audience that he's not that guy. And to me, an example of where this works is in Avengers, where you know that there's more powers at play than just Loki, but it's very much kept in shadow, and also Loki is not just absolutely, like, sucking up to Thanos by that point. Like, he's trying to be like, no, you owe me what, like, I was promised for this. So it doesn't nerf him, and by the time Thanos is shown to you, Loki's been defeated for the movie. But in this one, because there's so much goddamn Sauron, Azog just feels like he's not really that big of a threat, which is a problem for the climax, which is good after this because Thorin's death scene is great, but then is immediately undercut by Killy's death scene, which kind of sucks.
Yeah.
Because rather than it being with his brother, who he has a better relationship with, it's with Tariel in this romance that sucks. And this romance is even worse in this movie because they're like barely together.
Mm-hmm.
They're separated for most of the film, so the sad scene where she's crying over him because he died, and it just, I feel nothing. It's awful.
There's
and
really
I also,
no reason to kill him either. Like, why did he die?
Yeah, I don't know. Why didn't they just go be a dwarf-elf couple? Honestly, the fact that they were a dwarf-elf couple might have made more sense for why she doesn't exist in the future movies. Like, she got shunned because she married a dwarf, and they went off to live in the forest and happy life of not caring about racism. That honestly probably might have been a little better, even though I don't care. Also, really quick, I want to circle back to something you said about Legolas and about you liking him more in this movie than the other one. I'm not sure I agree with that, because Legolas in this movie is supposed to have an arc, but it sucks. He talks about his dead mother, which means nothing. Like, there's no real exploration of how that's impacted him at all. It's obviously somehow impacted his relationship with his father, but that relationship is dumb because it doesn't ever really get resolved. Like, Legolas and Thranduil's relationship is more of an argument between Thranduil and Tariel, because she's the one who's like, you have no love, and it kind of makes him realize, like, hey, maybe I should just kind of let my son go do his thing if he doesn't want to be around me anymore. But again, it's a problem of, like, the relationships not matching up with the characters, because Legolas resolves nothing with his father, a relationship that's been established for 3 movies, you know, in bits and pieces. So Legolas's arc just doesn't really mean anything, because he has, like, kind of problems with both his parents, and they kind of try to build it up like it's going somewhere. And in the end, they kind of just shrug and say, actually, just don't have parents then. Go off, do your thing. Which I guess is fine, because it flows kind of into the Fellowship of the Ring, but then just like, why do it at all? Like, why did he? One thing that never makes any sense to me is why originally did he go to Golgabad or whatever the fuck that place is called? He felt like he needed to go there to do something, confirmed that there was an army there, and then felt like he had to go back to warn them that there was another army coming. That seems to happen a lot in these movies, is like, characters seem to have a magical sense that they should go somewhere to advance the plot, but then they don't do anything at that location, and then they go back to where they were. Like in the second movie, when Gandalf went to Dol Guldur, verified that his theories were correct about why he needed to go there, and then decided he had to leave anyway.
Yeah.
So there's just a lot of stuff like that. But anyway, point being, I do not like Legolas in this movie because they try to give him some kind of arc, but it's so like haphazardly thrown together that it means nothing.
Well, let me rephrase. I like Legolas' character. I don't like his arc. I think Legolas is more likable in this movie. He's closer to the Legolas that I know. He's more supportive of Tariel. He's a lot less like dickheadedness and like, oh, I'm better than you, and clearly like that token like pretty boy boyfriend that the girl doesn't want and wants the other raggedy guy. He's much more like closer to the character that I know, the one that has wisdom and understanding. It is just overall a more likable guy, even if his arc was shit. I liked him more because he was more likable than he was in the second movie. One thing I didn't understand about Legolas is why he was helping Thorin. Like, I get that he was against the orcs, but it felt like at the climax of the movie, him and Thorin were like a team. And it was odd to me because Tariel's over 20 feet away getting her ass kicked by Bolg, and Legolas is too distracted by helping Thorin against the army of orcs to care until the very last second where she's about to die. And then it was cool that he threw Thorin back his sword that he had been using in the first movie and the beginning of the second movie. But, like, it was kind of a lot for me to believe that Legolas would throw away his only weapon to help a guy that he didn't ever really like or establish that he liked at all and didn't have much interaction with. It was cool in the terms of action and that full circle moment for Thorin getting his sword back, but the decision didn't really make much sense to me. Like, why was it Legolas that was there helping Thorin?
Also, sweet Jesus, that scene where he's like hanging off the bat and he beheads like 50 dudes at once. It's just, what are we fucking doing here, man?
Yeah, he's Spider-Man at that point.
But I mean, that is more heinous than like the Mumakil thing, I feel like. Like, that's even more improbable. Because like, at least in the Mumakil thing, like, you see he's doing stuff. He's hanging on the edge. He's like thinking about situations. He's looking around for like, okay, what can I do to get this this carrying thing off? In this, he literally just like, he's flying and then he just sticks his swords out and he gets like 30 kills.
Yeah, that was ridiculous. That was a video game moment if I've ever seen one.
What the fuck? I don't know. Anyway, so my two other nitpicks. One is like a fighting thing. So look, I don't mean to get too into the weeds, but I have to point this out. So I would assume in orc culture that like the stronger fighters are like the higher ranked in the military. That makes sense to me. But Blorg, what the fuck is his name? I can never even remember. Bolg is able to almost solo two characters who have slaughtered like 200 of his troops with basically no problems at all. If I were Sauron, fuck this whole orc breeding program. I'm just cloning this guy. Because it's very clear that the soldiers I'm sending out cannot kill the most powerful fighters in the land that I'm trying to take over. But this dude nearly kills Killy and Toriel with basically no problem. I thought that was kind of funny. It's like, could this dude really kill his whole army by himself if he wanted to? Because that's kind of what the movie's indicating. I don't think they're thinking about it like that, but it was just a funny observation. And now it's time for the nitpickiest nitpick of all to wrap up my thoughts on these movies.
Okay.
And it's the very, 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 very end of Battle of the Five Armies. And I do not know why this bothers me. But if you'll recall, the very end of the Battle of the Five Armies is as you're looking at, like, the book. They replay some of the audio from the beginning of Fellowship, where he goes out to greet Gandalf, right?
Yeah.
I listened to this, and I swear I'm right about this. They play that same dialogue, but they cut the line, "You haven't aged a day." which is the only thing in that scene that is anything but happy smiles. And that moment is important in that scene because you see the smile fade from Gandalf's face when he realizes what was going on. And I do not know why, but cutting that line just made me feel like it was one last little lame like jab at Lord of the Rings. I can't explain it, but just I guess I was just so jaded from these movies that change was just like, why? Why did you make that change?
I definitely feel like that is a pretty nitpicky nitpick. My
Yeah,
only explanation would be that he clearly has aged. Like, it was a straight up lie that Gandalf said that he hadn't aged a day, and there wasn't really like anything to fact check that before the Hobbit movies had come out. So maybe recalling, I don't know why they did it. I don't think they should have, but maybe their reasoning was that that would like remind the viewer in the last moments of the Hobbit that they had initially filmed Lord of the Rings without knowing that the Hobbit existed. So they made decisions that might not line up with the continuity.
that's fair. And I will say one of the things that I do think is kind of interesting. Again, we've crapped on the Sauron presence in this constantly, and I stand by that. But the one thing that I do kind of like when it comes to the ring, especially at the end where Bilbo lies and said that he lost it in the battle, is, you know, they make it very clear, and I forget what at one point Gandalf like says something about this, or someone says something about just like how like not that he's immune to like the dragon sickness, but he says something like it doesn't affect like someone of your character or something like that. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah.
So it's interesting to me that the one way, one of the very few in which this film does make an interesting flow in Lord of the Rings, is that you get a sense from these movies that what Gandalf is saying is not entirely true. And it kind of reinforces the power of the ring because you're seeing a character who's extremely selfless, extremely loyal, generally tries to be extremely truthful, except when he feels like he has to lie to avoid a giant war that might, you know, kill tons of people, and seeing something that makes it so even like he has this weak spot, I actually feel like does lead into Fellowship better because it makes it a little more clear what has become of Bilbo when that little bit of weakness has been allowed to fester for decades, basically under Gandalf's nose. So, of all the tie ins to Lord of the Rings, that is one that I actually thought kind of enhances the beginning of Fellowship rather than so many other things in this movie that like detract or raise questions about the logic of the original trilogy.
Yeah, I think the ring in general and the way that it's dealt with in the Hobbit trilogy is the one good tie-in to the Lord of the Rings that the trilogy does
Again, except the fact
consistently.
that Sauron can't fucking find it.
Right, except for that very obvious plot hole. But that I think is more not a detriment to the ring being involved, but a detriment to Sauron being involved whatsoever. That I think is the more egregious sin that the movie commits. But the ring itself and its presence, I think, is done really well. Like when Bilbo finds it with Gollum, that scene is almost perfect. It's executed very well. The fact that he feels like he has to lie about it throughout the entire trilogy adds to what you're saying about Bilbo, who's mostly a selfless, mostly an honorable, stand-up guy, having that weakness with the ring. There's only one scene in the entire trilogy where Bilbo recognizes that this ring might be kind of bad for him, which is when he loses it in that spider fight and then has to kill the baby spider and like goes up to the baby spider who's dead and goes, mine. And then he like has a moment with himself where he realizes he acted really like irrationally and violent to get that ring back. If that scene had happened any more times than it did, I would have thought that was played up too much. But the fact that a scene like that only ever happened once was perfect for me. And that's the one thing I think the Hobbit movies did kind of well when integrating the Lord of the Rings trilogy with it, is everything that had to do with the One Ring, because it was subtle throughout the films. It wasn't a focus except for very, very small moments. And like you said, that ending where Gandalf reveals that he knew that he had it the whole time and tells him to be kind of careful with it, while Bilbo was still lying to his face about it, you know, at the very end. It's really well done, and it shows, like you were saying, it shows a character that we've come to know throughout this trilogy that is honorable, selfless, likable, and only thinks of home, to having the same weakness that all the characters did with the ring in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Like, it really drives that home and connects to Lord of the Rings really well, in my opinion.
Oh,
But
also one other thing. Why did Sauron give a shit about collecting the lesser rings. Because that's one of the reasons why he was out there and why he wanted to capture or kill Gandalf, is because Gandalf had one of the rings.
Why is Sauron? That's just my
Yeah.
overall thing about the whole thing. I 100% agree with you about everything Sauron in these movies. I just wish he didn't exist. I wish he wasn't there. It really detracts. Like, if the only real connection that the Hobbit had to the Lord of the Rings was the ring, I think these movies would be so much better. The quality overall for every movie would be improved. Maybe not like enough for it to be as good as Lord of the Rings, definitely not, but it would at least be. There's so much of the contrived bullshit and the unnecessary additions comes from that B story that they want in every movie, that Sauron is back and blah blah blah, and it's all of it. I like almost none of it. Even the scene that you pointed out that you kind of like, with Elrond and Saruman coming in and like the Avengers and fighting all the evil guys. I don't like that scene because it just doesn't even feel. It doesn't feel like a fucking Lord of the Rings or Hobbit scene. It feels like an event. It feels like a Marvel movie scene. It feels so out of place to me.
And I think the other thing too that I was going to say is just like, there is an underlying concept with Sauron and what Gandalf's learning throughout the movies of people are fighting over treasure, but there is a rising darkness. But that is so wrapped up, like those plots are so entangled that it's not, like you were alluding to, just wanting it to be a lot more subtle with Sauron. It's not subtle, and that message never really gets resolved, because again, the way Fellowship starts, it really treats it like these movies didn't happen, because otherwise they would have had decades of foreknowledge that there was a rising tide of darkness. And to me, it raises, like, the presence of Sauron just raises so many questions about the beginning of Fellowship, and that's sort of why I think it's a problem. Is, again, depending on how you watch it, the movie either makes Fellowship just look dumber, or it is just focusing on something that if you were just walking into this universe for the first time, you wouldn't understand or have any reason to care about. So, I mean, I think there was sort of a place for Sauron, especially from the sense of Gandalf feeling the need to wrap up this situation quickly because there are bigger problems, but that is not really how it's approached.
No, and yeah, again, if you were to add Sauron, it being more subtle and it being a lot less like in your face, just having a lot less focus in the stories and in the movies in general would be the way to go about it, and it's not the way that they went about it. That being said, Battle of the Five Armies, we hardly talked about the beginning of it, but the first 12 minutes of that movie is really good, even if it's out of place. I really like their battle with Smaug, the village, like, trying to survive a dragon attacking them. I like the way the village is like try to rebuild itself and its role in the Battle of the Five Armies. Which, by the way, a negative I wanted to point out before we wrap this up is that there aren't 5 armies. Have you ever counted the armies?
Oh no, I noticed that for sure. There's like three, kind of 4.
There's the elves, the dwarves, the village people, and the orcs. And unless you're trying to say that the orcs are 2 separate armies because they were like of different races or like backgrounds or whatever, or if you're trying to say that the dwarves in the mountain were their own army, that doesn't make any sense. There weren't 5 armies. Earlier, you said something. You said, I don't know how much of this is in the book, when you were referencing, like, I think it was Thorin's, like, descent. I don't know if you know this. This whole movie, the Battle of the Five Armies,
is like 1 chapter.
It's like, not even. It's like 2 paragraphs, I believe. Bilbo gets knocked out, and then like 2 paragraphs go by explaining what happened while he was knocked out, and then it's over. I'm pretty sure that's it. Maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's a chapter, but I'm pretty sure it's like 1 or 2 paragraphs.
Yeah, not a great thing to build a 2-hour and 45-minute movie around.
No, and I agree. That's why a lot of the silly shit in this movie exists. But that also, I think, gives credit to a lot of the good shit that they added. And so, to me, this movie going from like completely unwatchable and never having an interest in seeing it again to me actually really enjoying it and like thinking it was better than what I thought was my favorite movie of the trilogy was really surprising to me. Overall, I'm really these movies. I'm happy they exist. I really like the Middle Earth move, like the world of Middle Earth. Lord of the Rings is probably, in my opinion, the best trilogy of all time. I can't think of any other trilogy that really even comes close. Even ones that I really love, like Guardians or the Pirates movies, which we will have a whole separate video on because you suck. But none of those trilogies even really come close to the Lord of the Rings. And even though we have another trilogy in Middle Earth that I think is not as good, but it's an extension of that universe, it makes me happy. I would take these movies over the prequels. I would take these movies over the Pirate trilogy. There's a lot of trilogies that I like really love and adore that I would take these movies over because I love the feeling of them. I love watching them. Even the crappy parts, even the middle of Smaug, even the silly parts of Battle of the Five Armies. It doesn't take away from the overall experience for me. When I watched the beginning of Unexpected Journey and I saw all these dwarves, having their moments and Bilbo getting to learn who they are and going on this adventure with them, all the way up until the end where Thorin's dead, Keely and Fili are dead, and the rest of the dwarves are like watching him go as he leaves the home that he put them in. It's very touching to me, and I forgot to mention this, but the ending of Battle of the Five Armies when Bilbo returns to the Shire, and all of his shit is being sold because I thought he was dead. I like how Bilbo goes from being really upset about that to walking in his house, seeing it be full of nothing, and it kind of looking like he doesn't really care because he already feels that pull of adventure that he's changed. He's a changed person. He goes from being the home-loving, comfort over everything character to craving more adventure, which we know about him already from Fellowship when he decides to leave for more adventure. There's a lot of value in that arc of Bilbo. I just think that these movies, I'm going to take something from you. I would prefer we had kind of subpar Middle Earth movies that expand the universe that I love than they didn't exist and we only had the Lord of the Rings trilogy because I just love this universe and I love experiencing everything about it.
I feel like maybe this exists, but if it doesn't, I would like it too. I would like someone somewhere to try to do what they did with like the Peter Jackson King Kong, and make a fan cut of the Hobbit that is good. Between all of this stuff, there is a good 3.5 hour movie buried in here somewhere. Maybe like 4 hour. There is something there. It's just there is a lot of bullshit to cut through that makes it hard to fully realize. Now, again, these movies are not the Transformers sequels where they actively make me wonder why I even bother to like this franchise. They're not the Pirates movies, which besides the first one, I just don't give a shit about.
They're great. You suck. We're going to make another video on that.
Damn it, you're going to make me rewatch those?
Yeah.
No!
Yes. Those are great movies.
But none of these movies have that effect of like making me feel like mad about them in an overall sense. Are there moments where I'm like, oh my god, that was so stupid? Are there characters that I actively want to avoid having to watch? Yes. But on the whole, there's like just enough good stuff or just enough passable stuff or just enough stuff that's bad in a way I find kind of enjoyable that these movies, while they don't really excite me that much, they don't inspire any really like super strong lasting negativity. They're not quite the level of the Star Wars prequels in the sense of I don't find myself thinking about their good and bad things nearly as much as I do the Star Wars prequels. I'm trying to think of a franchise that's like on par with how I feel about these, and I can't think of a great example right now. There's got to be something.
Well, maybe that speaks to the quality of these movies. They're unique in that way. I think the prequels is a good comparison.
They're unique in that they inspire me to care just enough, but not that much. Like they've found a sweet spot where I care about them just enough that I don't like hate them by any stretch, but they don't quite inspire the same level of like dumb enjoyment in me that the Star Wars prequels do. Or something like that. So they exist in a weird middle ground. They exist in a weird middle ground between those two ideas. No, I just thought of a great comparison that kind of matches how I feel. These movies, with the exception of the fact that I think one of them is probably worse than any of the Hobbit movies, these movies are just like the Cars franchise.
Okay.
I acknowledge they exist. I acknowledge that many people like them. I acknowledge that some people hate them. For me, they just inspire kind of a shrug.
I think these movies will always have a soft spot in my heart because I was very excited for them. I ever since I had watched Lord of the Rings and I had some older one of my friends that was a little bit older than me tell me that they were going to be making a Hobbit movie, and explain to me all about what the Hobbit was. I was so excited for this to come out. It took forever, and when it did, I was really happy with it initially, right up until Battle of the Five Armies, which I was sour on at first, but now I have a lot more appreciation for. And I think I just have a lot more appreciation for these movies in general. I stand by what I said, that I would rather these movies exist and expand the world of Middle Earth than they didn't, and all we had was Lord of the Rings. These feel like Middle Earth movies, while they may almost too much feel like Lord of the Rings movies at times. There are times where they do remind me of Lord of the Rings, and that's a good thing. And there are times where they are their own separate, unique journey that I find very fun and enjoyable, and silly and dumb, but mostly fun and enjoyable. And that's why I'm gonna name this video "The Hobbit Trilogy is good, and you should fight me."
Okay. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks for joining us on our 3-hour review of the Hobbit trilogy.